Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
The galaxy holds many horrors, from the hungering void of the Tyranids to the corrupting touch of chaos, from the soulless march of the Necrons to the insidious machinations of the Dark Elder. Humanity faces threats that could end civilization as we know it. Yet there exists one danger that eclipses them all, not because of what it is, but because of what it could become. This threat doesn't lurk in the shadows or plot in the darkness. It charges headlong into battle with a laugh, paints its war machines red to make them go faster, and believes that purple is the color of stealth because no one has ever seen a purple orc. They are everywhere, countless beyond measure, and they represent perhaps the most terrifying what-if scenario in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. What if the Orks remembered how powerful they truly are? It's a question that should keep the High Lords of Terror awake at night, assuming any of them truly understand what they're dealing with. The Greenskins, as they're often dismissively called, are treated by many Imperial commanders as a nuisance, a tide of Xenos filth to be purged whenever they grow too numerous. They're seen as crude, barbaric, and stupid. Their technology is dismissed as junk, held together by hope and violence. Their tactics are considered predictable, their strategies non-existent. This underestimation, this casual dismissal of the Orc threat, represents one of the Imperium's greatest blindnesses. Because the Orcs are not what they appear to be. They are not simple barbarians, stumbling through the stars on broken ships and rusted weapons. They are the degraded descendants of something far more terrifying, as something so powerful that it fought against gods and survived. The Orcs are the broken remnants of the Krork, the most successful warrior race ever engineered by the Old Ones themselves, created during the War in Heaven, when gods walked the material realm and reality itself bent under the weight of their conflict. The modern Orc, standing perhaps 7 to 8 feet tall, crude in manner and brutal in action, is a pale shadow of what their ancestors once were. The ancient Krork stood as tall as 12 meters, wore sophisticated power armor that would make space marine artificers weep with envy, and possessed intellects sharp enough to speak eloquently, plan strategically across millennia, and understand technology that current humanity can only dream of. They were not warriors who knew only war, but they were warriors who had been perfected for war. Their every cell, their every instinct, their every genetic marker designed for one purpose: to fight, to win, and to never, ever stop. But something happened. Over the millions of years since the War in Heaven, the Krork devolved. Without the guidance of their creators, without the endless pressure of fighting against the Necrons and their star-devouring Satan masters, the Krork slowly degraded into the Orcs we know today. They became smaller, less intelligent, more fractious. Their sophisticated technology was forgotten, replaced by the ramshackle contraptions held together with scrap metal and an unconscious psychic field. Their complex language and strategic thinking gave way to brutal simplicity and immediate gratification. They forgot what they were. They forgot what they could be. Yet the potential remains. Deep in their genetic code, locked away in the psychic gestalt field that connects every Orc to every other Orc, the memory of the Krork waits. It waits for the right conditions, the right pressure, the right moment when enough Orcs gather in one place with one purpose and remember, even for just an instant, what they truly are. This has happened before. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, when 6 prime Orcs arose and nearly destroyed the Imperium, humanity got a terrifying glimpse of what the Orcs could become. And now, in the 41st Millennium, there are signs that it might happen again. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka grows larger with each resurrection, speaks with unsettling eloquence, and leads the greatest green tide since the beast itself. And the question isn't whether the Orcs could remember their power. The question is what happens when they do. What happens when billions upon billions of Orcs, spread across every corner of the galaxy, suddenly realize that their ramshackle technology doesn't need to be ramshackle. What happens when they understand that their psychic gestalt field, the collective unconscious that binds them all, can do more than make red things go faster? What happens when they remember that they were created to be the ultimate warriors, and that every limitation they currently experience is self-imposed through ignorance? The answer is simple and terrifying. The galaxy burns. Not in the way it burns under the endless hunger of tyrannids, not in the corruption of chaos, not in the cold harvest of the Necrons. The galaxy burns green, or painted in the colors of Gork and Mork, transformed into an endless battlefield where the Orks finally achieve what they were always meant to achieve. Total domination through total war. Not because they desire conquest or power or any of the petty motivations that drive other races, but because fighting is what they were made for, and a galaxy of worthy opponents is what they were made to fight. This is not a story of heroes and villains. This is not a tale of good triumphing over evil. This is an examination of one of the most fundamental questions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, asked and answered through the lens of biology, history, and the terrible logic of genetic engineering taken to its ultimate extreme. This is the story of what happens when the galaxy's most numerous race, yet the species that breeds faster than any other, that cannot be truly eliminated because they spread through spores, that lives only for war and knows no fear, suddenly remembers that they were designed to be invincible. Let's begin at the beginning, in an age so ancient that it predates the rise of humanity, the birth of the elder gods, and the very concept of chaos as we understand it today. Let's go back to the war in heaven, when the Old Ones fought for their survival and created monsters to save themselves. The origins of power. When gods made warriors. 60 million years before humanity first looked up at the stars, before the Emperor walked among the tribes of ancient terror, before even the Eldar achieved dominance over the material realm, a war raged that would shape the destiny of every species that came after. Whilst the war in heaven was not a conflict of armies and nations, it was a war of fundamental forces, of reality itself being torn apart and remade according to the wills of beings so powerful that modern minds struggle to comprehend their nature. On one side stood the Necrontyr, a species dying from radiation sickness, their entire civilization built around the certainty of death and the desperate desire to escape it. They had made a terrible bargain with the Satan, star-devouring entities of such immense power that they could shatter suns and consume the life force of entire species. The Necrontyr had become the Necrons, immortal warriors housed in bodies of living metal, their souls consumed or enslaved, their empire spreading across the galaxy like a plague of silver and green. They could not be killed, only temporarily disabled. And their technology could unmake matter at the atomic level. Their weapons harvested stars and weaponized the fundamental forces of the universe itself. Against this seemingly unstoppable force stood the Old Ones, the first intelligent species to arise after the Satan, beings of such psychic mastery that they could shape the warp itself. They were ancient beyond measure, wise beyond human comprehension, and faced with an enemy that could not die and would not stop. The Old Ones could not match the Necrons in physical warfare. The living metal bodies of the soulless warriors were superior to anything biological in durability and strength. So the Old Ones did what they had always done when faced with a problem they couldn't solve directly. They created life. They began with the Elder, or a species of such psychic potential that each individual could learn to manipulate reality through force of will. The Elder were elegant, sophisticated, capable of incredible acts of creation and destruction through their mastery of the warp. But they were few in number, and while each Elder was powerful, they could not match the endless legions of Necron warriors that marched across the stars. The Old Ones needed something else, something that could be produced in vast numbers, that could fight forever without tiring, that could adapt and overcome any challenge through sheer persistence and evolutionary pressure. They needed soldiers, not scholars or artists or philosophers. They needed warriors, pure and simple, who would do nothing but fight from the moment of their birth until the moment of their death, and who would breed fast enough to replace their losses no matter how horrific the casualties. They needed a species that would view war not as a necessary evil or a political tool, but as the fundamental organizing principle of their entire existence. So they created the Krork. The Krork were a masterpiece of biological engineering. They combined elements from across the spectrum of life in the galaxy, mixing plant and animal characteristics into something that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. They were fungoid, reproducing through spores that would be released when they died, ensuring that killing a Krork didn't eliminate it, but instead planted the seeds for dozens more to grow in its place. They were symbiotic, existing as part of a broader ecosystem that included the smaller Gretchen for labor, the snotlings for basic functions, and the squigs as both food source and biological tools. They were engineered to grow throughout their lives, getting larger and stronger with age and combat experience, creating a natural hierarchy where the biggest and strongest would inevitably rise to leadership. But the true genius of the Krork design wasn't in their physical characteristics. It was in what the old ones embedded in their genetic code. The Krork possessed something called the Gestalt psychic field, a collective unconscious that connected every Krork to every other Krork across any distance. This field grew stronger as more Krork gathered together, creating a feedback loop where the presence of Krorks made other Krorks more powerful, which drew in more Krorks, which made the field even stronger. The Gestalt field had multiple functions. It allowed Krork to instinctively recognize hierarchy, knowing without words or displays of power who was bigger and therefore in charge. It facilitated the transfer of genetic knowledge, allowing Krork to be born with skills and understanding that would normally take years to learn. And most importantly, the Gestalt field interacted with reality in ways that seemed to bend the laws of physics themselves. It wasn't that the Krork believed something and it became true, as the simplified stories suggest. Rather, their collective psychic field could smooth over imperfections in technology, make marginal designs function beyond their theoretical limits, and create emergent properties that shouldn't exist based on the individual components involved. A Krork weapon might be built from scavenged parts that individually weren't particularly impressive, but when wielded by a Krork and empowered by the Gestalt field of thousands or millions of his fellows, that weapon would function far beyond what any Imperial tech priest could explain. The old ones encoded knowledge directly into Krork DNA through what modern Imperials call the technogene, though this term doesn't really capture the sophistication of what was achieved. The Krork weren't given blueprints or instruction manuals. They were given an instinctive understanding of how things worked, a gut feeling for mechanics and engineering that operated below the level of conscious thought. A Krork mech boy didn't need to study physics or attend an engineering academy. The knowledge was simply there, waiting to be accessed, improving and expanding as the mech boy aged, and the technogene continued to develop. When the Krork went to war, and they went to war from the moment they could stand, they were a sight that modern minds struggled to grasp. These were not the crude Orks of the 41st millennium, cobbling together scrap metal and hoping it worked. The Krork were sophisticated warriors wearing power armor that would make a Space Marine's plate look primitive by comparison. They wielded weapons that combined devastating firepower with elegant engineering. They understood tactics and strategy at a level that allowed them to fight the Necrons, who had been waging war for millions of years, to a standstill. Most the Krork weren't just soldiers. They were the soldiers, the perfect expression of what a warrior race could be. They stood as tall as Imperial dreadnoughts, towering over the battlefield like walking fortresses. Their armor was sophisticated enough to include force fields, self-repair systems, and integrated weapon platforms. Their weapons could punch through Necron-living metal, an achievement that even modern Imperial technology struggles to replicate consistently. They fought with a combination of savage enthusiasm and calculated precision, knowing when to charge headlong into battle and when to fall back, regroup, and strike from an unexpected angle. But what truly made the Krork terrifying was their numbers and their durability. Unlike the Eldar, who were powerful but few, or the Old Ones themselves, who were ancient but could not match the Necrons in warfare, the Krork could be everywhere at once. Every battlefield, every front, every theatre of war could have Krork forces, because killing Krork didn't eliminate them. It spread them. Every fallen Krork released spores that would grow into new Krork within years or even months, depending on conditions. You couldn't exterminate them. You could only delay them. And they never, ever stopped. The Krork didn't need supply lines or rest periods or time to recover from losses. They didn't suffer from low morale or question their purpose. They fought because fighting was what they were designed to do, what they were born to do, what every cell in their bodies was engineered to want to do. The Necrons could match them in individual durability. But the Krork could replace their losses infinitely faster. The C'tan were more powerful, but they were finite in number and could be overwhelmed through sheer persistence and tactical brilliance. The war in heaven raged for millions of years, an almost inconceivable length of time, even by the standards of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Stars were born and died during that conflict. Entire regions of space were rendered uninhabitable. The warp itself was damaged, twisted by the psychic emanations of countless dying beings and the weapons used by both sides. And through it all, the Krork fought. They fought the Necrons in the cold void of space and on burning worlds. They fought the C'tan themselves when those entities descended to the battlefield. They adapted to every new weapon, overcame every new strategy, and grew stronger with each engagement. Then something changed. The exact details are lost to time, but the war in heaven ended. The C'tan were shattered by their Necron servants, who were tired of being slaves to beings that consumed souls without thought or care. The Old Ones either died, fled, or transcended to something beyond physical form. The Necrons entered their great sleep, burying themselves in tomb worlds across the galaxy to wait out the ages until they could rebuild their strength. And the Eldar, who had been junior partners in the conflict, suddenly found themselves the dominant species in a galaxy littered with the ruins of gods. The Krork found themselves without enemies worthy of their design. The Necrons were gone, sleeping in their tombs. The C'tan were broken into shards. The Old Ones, their creators and commanders, had vanished. For the first time since their creation, the Krork existed in a galaxy without a war to fight. And this, paradoxically, was the beginning of their downfall. The Krork were designed for constant warfare against the most powerful enemies imaginable. They were optimized for fighting under the most extreme conditions against opponents who could not be underestimated. Without that constant pressure, without that endless conflict, something in their genetic structure began to change. Perhaps it was by design, a safeguard the Old Ones had built in to prevent their warrior race from becoming the new overlords of the galaxy. Perhaps it was simply the natural result of evolution, favoring traits that worked in the new environment over traits that were no longer necessary. Whatever the cause, the Krork began to devolve. It happened slowly, over countless generations and millions of years. They grew smaller, losing first inches and then feet, and then meters of height. Their power armor became less sophisticated, then crude, then was forgotten entirely in favor of scavenged plate and leather. Their weapons became simpler, their tactics less refined, their strategic thinking more immediate and less far-reaching. The techno-gene that gave them instinctive understanding of technology became more basic, more crude, more focused on getting something to work right now rather than building something that would work optimally. Most critically, they became fractious. The unity of purpose that had allowed the Krork to fight as a coordinated force across entire galaxies fractured into tribal warfare. Krork, who had once stood together against the Necrons, began fighting each other over perceived slights, territorial disputes, and simple boredom. The Gestalt psychic field that had made them such effective warriors began working against them, turning inward, creating feedback loops of aggression and violence that targeted other Krork as often as external enemies. By the time humanity began reaching for the stars, by the time the Emperor started his great crusade, the Krork were gone. In their place were the Orks, smaller, cruder, less intelligent copies of their ancestors. The average Ork might stand 7 or 8 feet tall instead of 12 meters. They cobbled together weapons from scrap metal instead of wielding sophisticated energy weapons. They fought in howling mobs instead of disciplined formations. They spoke in crude approximations of Low Gothic instead of the eloquent language the Krork had possessed. But the genetic potential remained. The Gestalt psychic field still existed, still connected every Ork to every other Ork, still grew stronger as more Orks gathered together. The techno-gene still passed down through the generations, still gave mech boys their instinctive understanding of mechanics. The spore-based reproduction still ensured that Orks would spread across every battlefield, every world they touched, creating ecosystems that could never be fully eliminated. And deep in the DNA of every Ork, in genetic sequences that might activate under the right conditions, the blueprint for the Krork waited. This is what the Imperium doesn't understand, what even the Eldar with all their ancient knowledge sometimes fail to grasp.
Yes, the Orks aren't a new species that happen to evolve into something vaguely similar to the ancient Krork. They are the Krork, degraded and diminished but still fundamentally the same at a genetic level. Everything they've forgotten can be remembered. Everything they've lost can be recovered. All it takes is the right trigger, the right conditions, the right moment when enough Orks gather with enough purpose and the genetic memory locked away in their cells reactivates. It's happened before, most notably during the War of the Beast, and all the signs suggest it could happen again, this time on an even larger scale. Because there are more Orks in the galaxy now than ever before in history, spread across more worlds, fighting more wars, growing stronger with each battle, and their greatest leader in millennia, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, continues to grow larger, smarter, more eloquent with each resurrection. He speaks of visions from Gork and Mork themselves. He unites disparate tribes under a single banner. He wages war with a strategic sophistication that his predecessors never displayed. The pieces are all in place. The stage is set. All that remains is for the Orks to remember what they are, and the galaxy will never be the same. The Gestalt field, the hidden strength that binds the green tide. To understand what would happen if the Orks truly awakened to their potential, we must first understand the mechanism through which that potential expresses itself. The Gestalt psychic field is not magic, despite how it might appear to those who witness its effects. It's not simply belief makes it so, as the simplified versions of the story suggest. The reality is far more complex, far more insidious, and far more dangerous than simple reality warping through collective faith. The Gestalt field is a psychic phenomenon that exists in a space between the material realm and the warp. It connects every Ork to every other Ork through a network that operates below the level of conscious thought. Individual Orks don't feel this connection in any way they could articulate. They don't sense the presence of distant brothers or receive telepathic messages from across the stars. But the connection exists nonetheless, subtle and pervasive, shaping their instincts, their behavior, and their physical reality in ways both small and profound. The Old Ones designed this field with specific purposes in mind, and understanding those purposes helps us understand how the field could be weaponized if Orks became fully aware of it. First and foremost, the Gestalt field serves as a recognition system. Orks instinctively know who is bigger, stronger, and therefore more worthy of leadership. This isn't a visual assessment based on height or muscle mass, though those physical characteristics certainly correlate with the Gestalt field's assessment. Rather, the field creates a kind of psychic weight that Orks can sense without understanding how they sense it. A war boss doesn't need to constantly prove his dominance through combat, though he often does anyway, because Orks enjoy fighting. His position is recognized and accepted by other Orks because the Gestalt field itself marks him as the biggest, decreating a natural hierarchy that prevents the constant infighting that would otherwise make Ork society completely non-functional. The second purpose of the Gestalt field is knowledge transfer. The techno gene that gives mech boys their instinctive understanding of mechanics doesn't exist in isolation. When a mech boy figures out how to make a bigger engine or a more powerful weapon, that knowledge doesn't stay locked in his head. Through the Gestalt field, it propagates to other mech boys, subtly, gradually, but inevitably. This is why Ork technology, despite appearing completely random and personalized, actually shows consistent patterns and developments across different Ork tribes that have never met. The Gestalt field creates a kind of racial memory and a collective unconscious where successful innovations are preserved and failed experiments are forgotten. But the third purpose of the Gestalt field is where things get truly interesting and truly dangerous. The field can affect physical reality in ways that seem to violate the laws of physics as understood by Imperial science. This is not quite the same as the reality-warping powers of chaos or the psychic might of the Eldar. The Gestalt field doesn't tear open the warp and pour its energies into the material realm. Instead, it creates what might be called quantum probability nudges, tiny adjustments to physical systems that push them toward functioning when they should fail. Consider an Ork weapon, a shooter built from scrap metal, rusty parts, and ammunition that looks more like gravel than proper bullets. By all rights, this weapon should explode in the Ork's hands or simply fail to fire. The barrel isn't properly rifled. The firing mechanism is held together with wire and hope. The ammunition doesn't fit the chamber correctly. Any one of a dozen physical flaws should make this weapon completely non-functional. Yet when the Ork pulls the trigger, it fires. The bullets somehow make it through the barrel. They even hit with enough force to punch through armor. This isn't because the Ork believes the weapon will work, though that belief is a component of the process. It's because the Gestalt field, powered by thousands or millions of nearby Orks, creates tiny probability adjustments at every point of potential failure. The barrel that should burst instead holds together, just barely. The firing pin that should break hits the primer at just the right angle. The bullet that should tumble instead flies reasonably true. None of these adjustments is large enough to be obviously supernatural. Each one is just barely within the realm of physical possibility. But taken together, across all the potential failure points, the result is a weapon that functions far better than it has any right to. Now scale that up. The Gestalt field's power increases exponentially, not linearly, with the number of Orks present. 2 Orks create a field slightly stronger than twice what a single Ork generates. 10 Orks create a field stronger than 10 individuals. 100 Orks create a field that begins to show dramatic effects. 1,000 Orks can make ramshackle vehicles fly when they have no business leaving the ground. 1,000,000 Orks can power war machines the size of Imperial Titans. And 1,000,000,000 Orks, or all gathered in one place, all focused on one purpose, create a Gestalt field that can warp reality on a planetary scale. During the War of the Beast, this power reached levels not seen since the days of the Krork themselves. The 6 prime Orks who led that crusade generated Gestalt fields so powerful that they influenced not just their own forces, but the very fabric of reality around them. Orks grew larger in their presence, not gradually, over years, but quickly, visibly, adding feet of height in weeks. Technology that had been crude and unreliable suddenly became sophisticated and precise. Weapons that should have required months to build were assembled in days. And most terrifyingly, the Orks began displaying strategic thinking and tactical coordination that rivaled the greatest human generals. The prime Orks themselves stood as tall as small buildings, encased in power armor that incorporated technology the Mechanicus couldn't fully understand, even after capturing examples. They spoke fluent High Gothic, not just the crude pidgin that most Ork war bosses use, but actual eloquent speech that demonstrated genuine intelligence. They understood logistics, supply lines, and combined arms warfare. They built attack moons, planetoid-sized weapons platforms that could teleport across the galaxy and destroy worlds with gravity weapons. They very nearly succeeded in conquering Terra itself, something that even Horus had failed to achieve. And here's what keeps the few Imperial commanders who truly understand the Ork threat awake at night. The Prime Orks didn't achieve this through slow evolution or careful study. They achieved it because the Gestalt field reached a critical threshold. When enough Orks gather with enough unity of purpose, the Gestalt field begins activating dormant genetic sequences. The Krork blueprint, still present in Ork DNA, starts expressing itself. Orks grow larger, their brains develop more complex structures, their instincts become sharper and more sophisticated. It's not magic or divine intervention. It's biology responding to environmental triggers, the same biology that the Old Ones engineered specifically to create warriors who would grow stronger in response to greater challenges. The Imperium managed to defeat the beast and his Prime Orks through desperate measures, enormous casualties, and more than a little luck. They killed the 6 Prime Orks one by one, as disrupting the Gestalt field and causing the Ork forces to fall into disarray. But that victory created a dangerous misconception. Imperial commanders assumed they had faced a unique threat, an aberration that would never be repeated. They didn't understand that the Prime Orks weren't special. They were just Orks who had been exposed to the right conditions to trigger their latent potential. Any Ork, given enough time, enough combat, and enough nearby fellows, could potentially become a Prime Ork. This is already happening again. Gazgakul Maguruk Thraka started as a relatively ordinary Ork, no different from millions of others, except for a head wound that killed 30% of his brain and forced a mech boy to install adamantium plates. But something happened to Gazgakul after that surgery. Whether it was the head injury, the metal plates interacting with his psychic field, or simply the accumulation of combat experience over decades of warfare, Gazgakul began to grow. Not just physically, though he's now larger than any Ork warboss in living memory, but intellectually. He speaks with unsettling eloquence. He makes plans that span years or even decades. He unites Ork tribes that would normally spend their time fighting each other. And most tellingly, Gazgakul has survived his own death. When Ragnar Blackmane of the Space Wolves decapitated him, that should have been the end. Instead, Mad Doc Grotznik attached Gazkul's head to a new, larger body, powered by a generator that exists partly in the warp itself. The resurrection made Gazkul even bigger, even stronger, even smarter than before. He's now referred to as the Prophet of the Orks. Speaking of visions from Gork and Mork themselves, whether these are actual divine communications or simply Gazkul's enhanced brain interpreting the Gestalt field in new ways, doesn't really matter. What matters is that the most powerful Ork in the galaxy continues to grow more powerful with each passing year. And Gazkul is not alone. Across the galaxy, other war bosses are rising, each one larger and more dangerous than their predecessors. The Gestalt field is strengthening. More Orks are being born or growing from spores on more worlds than at any point in Imperial history. The endless wars of the 41st Millennium provide exactly the kind of pressure that triggers Ork evolution. Every major conflict, every crusade, every desperate battle draws Orks like moths to flame, and each gathering of Orks strengthens the Gestalt field that much more. The Imperium doesn't understand what it's witnessing. They see the Ork threat growing and respond with more force, more crusades, more extermination campaigns. But every campaign against the Orks just makes them stronger. Every battle is an opportunity for Orks to fight, grow larger, and spread their spores. Every world purged of Orks becomes a potential breeding ground when a single spore survives the flames. The Imperium is caught in a feedback loop, where their attempts to control the Ork threat actively make it worse. Now imagine what happens when the Orks become aware of all this. Not just the war bosses, but every Ork everywhere, suddenly understanding through the Gestalt field exactly how powerful they could be. Imagine the Gestalt field itself strengthening as billions of Orks simultaneously realize that their crude technology doesn't need to be crude, that their ramshackle weapons could be as sophisticated as anything the Imperium or Eldar possess, if they just focused their collective psychic power properly. Imagine orcs across the galaxy, simultaneously growing larger as dormant genetic sequences activate all at once, responding to the unified thought running through the Gestalt field. We is the biggest, the strongest, the best. We is the Krork, and the galaxy belongs to the Orks. That's not a war the Imperium could win. That's not a threat any faction in the galaxy could successfully oppose. That's the apocalypse, wrapped in green skin and moving at a sprint. A war of the beast, the galaxy's warning that no one heeded.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore for quite a while, and this Orc scenario genuinely keeps me up at night. Not because it's scary in the traditional sense, but because of how plausible it is. We spend so much time worrying about Tyranids eating the galaxy or chaos corrupting everything, but the Orcs, they're already everywhere. They're already outnumbering every other faction combined. The genetic programming is already there, just waiting. What really gets me is how the Imperium's own strategy is making this worse. Every crusade against Orcs, every massive battle, every desperate last stand, it's all creating exactly the conditions that trigger Orc evolution. It's like fighting fire with gasoline. And the worst part, nobody's listening to the warnings. The Eldar tried to tell them during the War of the Beast. Commissar Yarrick has been saying for decades that Orcs are smarter than people think, but Imperial doctrine doesn't change, even when it's actively creating the threat it's trying to prevent. Gaskell has already shown us what's coming. Each time he's resurrected, he gets bigger, smarter, more articulate. He's not an anomaly, he's a preview, and that terrifies me more than any Chaos God or Xenos fleet ever could. Because this threat grows stronger every single day, and nobody's doing anything to stop it. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the story.
If you want to understand what an awakened Orc race would mean for the galaxy, you need to understand the War of the Beast. This was not some minor green tide that swept through a few unimportant systems before falling apart due to Orc infighting. This was the closest the Imperium has come to total annihilation since the Horus heresy itself, a conflict so devastating that it nearly broke humanity's grip on the stars despite occurring less than 1500 years after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne. The 32nd Millennium was supposed to be a time of rebuilding and consolidation. The Horus heresy was a fading memory, still painful, but no longer an immediate threat. The Space Marine legions had been broken up into smaller chapters to prevent any single commander from wielding enough power to threaten the Imperium again. The Adeptus Mechanicus was working to rebuild the technological infrastructure that had been damaged during the Civil War. The common citizens of the Imperium were beginning to believe that the worst was behind them, that they could look forward to a future of relative peace and prosperity. They were wrong. In 544 of the 32nd Millennium, the Orcs attacked in numbers that defied comprehension. These weren't the typical Orc raids that Imperial worlds had learned to expect and defend against. These were coordinated assaults executed with precision and strategic planning that no one thought Orcs capable of achieving. Entire sectors fell in days. Our worlds that had stood against Orc attacks for centuries were suddenly overrun by green tides that displayed tactics and technology far beyond anything seen before. At the heart of this storm was a being known simply as the Beast. The name itself was deliberately vague, chosen by Imperial commanders who couldn't quite bring themselves to use the Orcs' actual designation, which translated roughly to, "I am slaughter," or Lord, who will bring great slaughter. The Beast stood at least 10 meters tall, possibly taller depending on which reports you believe. He wore power armor so sophisticated that Mechanicus tech priests, who examined captured pieces, couldn't fully understand how it worked. He wielded weapons that made a mockery of Imperial engineering, the force fields that shrugged off Lascanan fire and power claws that could tear through ceramite like paper. But the Beast's physical presence, as terrifying as it was, wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he was intelligent. Not cunning in the brutish way that Orc war bosses sometimes display, but genuinely, frighteningly intelligent. The Beast spoke perfect High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperial nobility and government. He understood Imperial political structure well enough to manipulate it. He sent an ambassador to Terror itself, an Ork who delivered terms for humanity's surrender with the kind of diplomatic protocol that would have been appropriate at a negotiation between peer empires. Think about that for a moment. The Orks sent a diplomat to Terra, not a howling war boss screaming threats, but an actual ambassador who followed diplomatic protocol, who understood that he was dealing with a fragmented government paralyzed by internal politics, who knew exactly how to phrase his demands to create maximum chaos among the High Lords. When that ambassador was rebuffed, as everyone knew he would be, he left peacefully, taking his ship and departing the Sol system. And then the real attack began. The Orks deployed attack moons, planetoid-sized weapons platforms that could teleport across the galaxy, using technology the Imperium didn't understand and couldn't counter. These weren't crude constructions held together by Ork belief and prayers to Gork and Mork. These were sophisticated war machines with functioning force fields, accurate targeting systems, and weapons that could shatter continents. As one of these attack moons positioned itself in orbit over Terra itself, the throne world of humanity, and hung there like a green moon of doom, while the High Lords scrambled to figure out how to respond. The Imperium's initial response was catastrophic. The Imperial Fists, one of the founding chapters descended from the First Legion, launched an assault on Ardamantua to face what they thought was a manageable Ork threat. They were wrong. The Imperial Fists were destroyed almost to the last man, not defeated, not forced to retreat, but actually destroyed as a fighting force. Chapter Master Cassus, Mirhen, fell in battle. The fleet was lost. The handful of survivors were scattered and broken. This was one of the Emperor's own chapters. Warriors who had fought at his side during the Great Crusade descended from Rogel Dawn himself, and they were obliterated. The disaster at Ardamantua should have been a wake-up call, a clear signal that something unprecedented was happening. Instead, the High Lords of Terra descended into political infighting, each one more concerned with protecting their own power base than addressing the existential threat that was literally hanging over their heads. The Lord Commander of the Imperium refused to take decisive action. The Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus saw the attack moon not as a weapon to be destroyed, but as technology to be studied and perhaps captured. The Adeptus Ministorum worried more about how the crisis would affect the faith of Imperial citizens than about the actual military situation. Meanwhile, the Orks rampaged across Imperial space with impunity. They didn't just attack, they conquered. They established actual occupation forces on captured worlds, something Orks historically never bothered with, because they got bored after the fighting stopped. They built cities, massive sprawling urban centers that showed genuine planning and organization. The capital of their empire, the city of Gorkogrod on Ulanor, covered most of a planetary surface and included structures that rivaled anything the Imperium could build. The Beast's palace sat at the exact spot where the Emperor and his Primarchs had assembled 1,500 years earlier, during the triumph of Ulanor, a deliberate insult that showed just how much the Beast understood about human psychology and symbolism. The only thing that saved the Imperium was the return of a Primarch. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamander's Legion, emerged from wherever he had been during the millennia since the heresy and took command of the Imperial response. His presence alone was enough to rally the scattered Space Marine chapters, giving them hope that the situation could be salvaged. An invasion of Ulanor was planned, a desperate gambit to strike at the heart of the Ork Empire and kill the Beast himself. The invasion force that assembled for this assault was staggering. Multiple Space Marine chapters contributed forces. The Imperial Navy committed thousands of ships. The Astra Militarum sent millions of soldiers. It was the largest military operation the Imperium had mounted since the Great Crusade itself, and it was all aimed at a single world. The hope was that killing the Beast would disrupt the Ork hierarchy and cause their empire to collapse into the typical infighting that usually characterized Ork society. When the Imperial forces arrived at Ulanor, they found a world that had been completely transformed. What had once been a relatively primitive Ork stronghold was now a thriving planet-wide city, protected by force fields and defensive weapons that made planetary bombardment impossible. The Imperial forces were forced to land their troops directly into the maw of the Ork defenses, fighting street by street through urban terrain that heavily favored the defenders. The Orks didn't just throw themselves at the attackers in typical Ork fashion. They used the terrain, set ambushes, fell back to prepared positions, and generally fought with a level of tactical sophistication that shocked Imperial commanders. The final assault on the Beast's palace was led by Vulcan himself, accompanied by the best warriors the Imperium could field. They fought their way through hundreds of Orks, through defensive systems that would have stopped entire armies, until finally they reached the inner sanctum where the Beast waited. What followed was a duel that showcased just how far above normal Orks the Beast had risen. Vulcan, a Primarch, a being crafted by the Emperor himself to be the pinnacle of human evolution, fought the Beast to a standstill. Eventually, through skill, power, and more than a little desperation, Vulcan managed to kill the Beast, ending the creature's reign and seemingly winning the war. Except it wasn't over. Because as the Imperial forces began celebrating their hard-won victory, another Beast appeared, and then another. And then it became terribly clear there wasn't one Beast. There were 6 of them, 6 prime Orks of incredible size and power, each commanding their own legion of Orks. The Beast that Vulcan had killed was just one of 6, and while killing him disrupted the Ork forces in that region, the other 5 continued their campaigns without pause. The revelation that there were multiple beasts nearly broke Imperial morale. How do you fight an enemy that can replace their supreme leader 5 more times? How do you plan a strategy when killing the enemy's warlord doesn't actually solve the problem? The Imperium had committed everything to killing one beast, and now they discovered there were 5 more waiting. What followed was a desperate campaign to eliminate the remaining prime Orks one by one. It took a reverse Gestalt field powered by captured Ork Psychers and Sisters of Silence to weaken the Orks enough to make this possible. It took Space Marine chapters working together in ways that violated the principles laid down after the heresy. It took resources and troops that the Imperium could barely spare, casualties that would take centuries to fully recover from, and sacrifices that haunt Imperial military doctrine to this day. Eventually, through desperate measures and tremendous losses, the Imperium managed to kill all 6 prime Orks and shatter their empire. But the victory came at an almost unbearable cost. The Imperial fists had been completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt from their successor chapters. And dozens of worlds were left in ruins. The Space Marine chapters took casualties that wouldn't be fully replaced for centuries. The Adeptus Mechanicus lost irreplaceable archaeotech in the fighting. The Astra Militarum regiments were ground down to nothing. And perhaps most critically, the political chaos caused by the war led to the beheading, the assassination of all the High Lords of Terror by the Grand Master of Assassins, who had become disgusted with their incompetence during the crisis. The War of the Beast should have taught the Imperium several crucial lessons. First, that Orks are capable of far more sophistication and organization than Imperial doctrine suggested. Second, that the Ork threat grows exponentially more dangerous as more Orks gather together. Third, that there's a tipping point, a critical mass. It's where Orks transform from a manageable nuisance into an existential threat. And fourth, that the genetic potential for prime Orks exists in all Orks, waiting to be triggered under the right conditions. The Imperium learned none of these lessons. Instead, they treated the War of the Beast as an aberration, a unique event that would never be repeated. They went back to viewing Orks as crude barbarians whose occasional uprisings could be crushed through superior technology and discipline. They convinced themselves that the prime Orks had been special cases, possibly contaminated by chaos or enhanced by Xenos technology, rather than understanding that any Ork could potentially become a prime Ork given enough time and the right circumstances. This failure to learn from the War of the Beast is one of the Imperium's greatest mistakes. Because the conditions that created the prime Orks are not unique. They're actually becoming more common in the 41st millennium. There are more orcs in the galaxy now than during the 32nd millennium. They're fighting more wars, gathering in larger numbers, and being led by more powerful war bosses. The Gestalt field is stronger than it's been in millennia, and at the center of it all is Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, who grows larger and more sophisticated with each resurrection, who speaks of visions from Gork and Mork, who unites orc tribes under a single banner in ways not seen since the beast himself. The War of the Beast was a warning. It was the galaxy's alarm bell, ringing loud and clear, showing everyone exactly what happens when orcs approach their true potential, and the Imperium, through ignorance, arrogance, and bureaucratic inertia, chose to ignore that warning. Now, in the 41st millennium, as Gazkul's green tide sweeps across more and more worlds, as orc war bosses grow larger and more intelligent, as the Gestalt field strengthens with every passing year, that warning is about to become a prophecy fulfilled. The beast nearly destroyed the Imperium with 6 prime orcs. Gazkul, the prophet of the orcs, potentially commands billions of orcs across thousands of worlds. If even a fraction of them were to reach prime orc status, if the Gestalt field were to trigger mass evolution across the entire orc species, the War of the Beast would look like a minor skirmish by comparison. The galaxy survived the last time orcs approached their true power, but barely, and only through desperate measures and catastrophic losses, whilst the next time might not offer the same opportunity for salvation. The Prophet, Gazkul, and the Signs of Awakening. Gazkul, Mag Uruk Thraka, is not like other orc war bosses. This might seem like an obvious statement given his status as the most powerful orc in the galaxy, but it goes deeper than simple military success or accumulated victories. Gazkul represents something that should terrify every faction in the 41st millennium. He is proof that orcs can evolve toward their Krork heritage, even without massive gatherings of billions. He is proof that the genetic triggers can activate in individual orcs under the right conditions. And he is proof that once those triggers activate, they don't deactivate. Each time Gazkul dies and is resurrected, he comes back bigger, stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than before. Chantic Gazkul's origin story is almost mundane by orc standards. He started as a relatively ordinary orc in a relatively ordinary tribe on the world of Urk. He was a member of the Goths, the largest and most aggressive of the orc clans, but nothing particularly distinguished him from millions of other Goth boys beyond typical orc toughness and enthusiasm for violence. Then he took a bolt round to the head during a raid. The projectile destroyed roughly 30% of his skull, killed a significant portion of his brain, and should have ended his existence. Any other orc would have died on that battlefield, his body releasing spores that would grow into new orcs who would never know his name. Instead, Gazgakul was dragged to Mad Doc Grotznik, a pain boy whose reputation for keeping orcs alive through procedures that would kill them in more sensible hands was well established. Grotznik looked at the massive head wound, the exposed brain tissue, and the dying orc, and saw not a lost cause, but an opportunity. He cut away the destroyed portions of Gazgkul's skull and replaced them with adamantium plates, the same material used in Space Marine power armor. Then he did something that he couldn't quite explain, something that the Gestalt field itself seemed to guide him toward. He incorporated bits of machinery into the plates, creating what was essentially a crude cybernetic interface between Gazkul's brain and the metal protecting it. When Gazkul woke up, he was different. He spoke of visions, as of voices that he identified as Gork and Mork themselves, giving him instructions. Whether these were actual divine communications, hallucinations caused by the head wound, or Gazkul's damaged brain interpreting the Gestalt field in new ways doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that Gazkul believed he had been chosen by the orc gods to unite all orcs everywhere in an endless crusade across the stars. He believed he was the prophet of the Great Green, destined to lead the orcs to total domination of the galaxy. More importantly, other orcs believed it too. The Gestalt field, responding to whatever changes had occurred in Ghazkul's psyche, marked him as special. Other orcs felt drawn to him, recognized him as bigger even before his physical size increased to match that psychic weight. Within years, Ghazkul had united his tribe, then conquered neighboring tribes, then absorbed entire clans into his growing horde. He didn't just fight and win, he planned and executed strategies that showed genuine tactical thinking. He waited when waiting would weaken his enemies. He struck when striking would maximize damage. He preserved his forces when preservation meant he could fight again later. Ghazkul's first major campaign targeted the hive world of Armageddon, one of the Imperium's most heavily defended and strategically important planets. The choice of target itself showed Ghazkul's sophistication. He didn't attack random worlds or pursue easy conquests. He went after a world whose loss would hurt the Imperium significantly, whose defense would draw in Imperial forces from across the sector, whose capture would give him a major industrial base, and more importantly, a planet full of enemies to fight. The First War for Armageddon, as it came to be known, showcased Ghazkul's strategic ability. He didn't simply throw waves of orcs at Imperial defensive positions. He used speed and mobility to strike where defenses were weak, then withdrew before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. He targeted supply lines and command centers, showing an understanding of military logistics that orcs normally don't possess. When his initial assaults were repulsed, he adapted his tactics rather than simply trying the same approach with more force. The Imperium eventually drove Ghazkul off Armageddon, but only through the intervention of multiple Space Marine chapters and guard regiments numbering in the millions. Yet the cost in Imperial lives was catastrophic. Whole regiments were wiped out, cities burned, the planet's economy was devastated, and Ghazkul escaped, taking most of his forces with him, to rebuild and strike again somewhere else. That somewhere else turned out to be Armageddon again, exactly 57 years later to the day. Ghazkul returned with an even larger force, having spent the intervening decades gathering more tribes and growing larger himself. The Third War for Armageddon made the First War look like a minor skirmish by comparison. This time, Ghazkul conquered half the planet's surface before being stopped. This time, his tactics were even more sophisticated, his forces better equipped, his strategic planning more far-reaching. Our Imperial forces under Commissar Yarrick and multiple chapter masters fought the Green Tide to a standstill, but couldn't defeat it outright. The war devolved into a grinding stalemate that continues to this day, decades later, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Then came Ragnar Blackmane. The young space wolf, champion of his chapter, managed to track down Ghazkul in the midst of battle and challenged him to single combat. What followed was a duel that lasted 10 days, an almost unthinkable length of time for such an engagement. In the end, Ragnar's frost axe found Ghazkul's neck, severing the warboss's head from his body. Victory was declared. The beast of Armageddon was dead, except he wasn't. Mad Doc Grotznik, who had saved Ghazkul once before, did it again. But this time, he didn't just repair damage. While he improved upon the original design. Grotznik placed Ghazkul's head, still alive due to orc resilience and the adamantium plates protecting the vital parts of his brain, onto a new body. Not just any body, but one specifically engineered and enhanced to be larger and more powerful than before. The new body incorporated a power generator that existed partially in the warp itself, drawing energy from the immaterial realm to fuel Ghazkul's mechanical systems. When Ghazkul awoke in his new body, he was even larger than before, standing nearly as tall as an Imperial dreadnought. His physical strength had increased proportionally, but more troubling was the increase in his intellectual capacity. Ghazkul spoke with even greater eloquence than before. His strategic planning showed even more sophistication, and he began making references to events and concepts that an orc shouldn't know or understand, suggesting that either his enhanced brain was accessing genetic memories passed down from the Krork, or that his partial existence in the warp was giving him access to knowledge he shouldn't possess. Ghazkul immediately declared that his death and resurrection proved the favor of Gork and Mork. He was immortal, he claimed, unable to be truly killed because the Ork gods had work for him to do. And other Orks believed him, because the Gestalt field told them it was true. His resurrection created a mythology around him, transforming him from merely the biggest war boss into a genuine prophet, a divine agent with a holy mission to unite all Orks everywhere. But the signs of Krork genetic memory activating in Gazg-Kul are unmistakable to anyone who knows what to look for. His size continues to increase with each resurrection, approaching the dimensions of the ancient Krork, who stood 12 meters tall. His armor, while still appearing crude to casual inspection, shows evidence of sophistication that normal Ork technology shouldn't possess. His power claw, Gork's Claw, can tear through ceramite and adamantium with ease. His weapon, Mork's Roar, fires shells with accuracy and power far exceeding normal Ork shooters. But the most telling sign is his intelligence. Gazg-Kul doesn't just plan battles, he plans campaigns spanning years. He doesn't just unite nearby tribes, he coordinates Ork movements across multiple sectors. He speaks of a vision of the entire galaxy united under Ork domination, and not through conquest alone, but through the establishment of a stable Ork civilization that could sustain itself and continue expanding forever. This is not normal Ork thinking. Normal Orks live for the moment, for the next fight, the next challenge. They don't plan for futures they might not live to see. They don't think about sustainability or long-term strategy. Gazg-Kul does, and that should terrify everyone. Because if Gazg-Kul represents what happens when a single Ork begins accessing Krork genetic memories, imagine what happens when millions or billions of Orks undergo the same transformation simultaneously. Imagine what happens when the Gestalt field, strengthened by unprecedented numbers of Orks across the galaxy, triggers mass activation of dormant genetic sequences. Imagine what happens when every Ork everywhere suddenly gains the strategic thinking, technical sophistication, and organized discipline of the ancient Krork, while retaining the Ork love of violence and complete lack of fear. The Imperium can barely fight Gazg-Kul's forces, even with Orks, in their current degraded state. Multiple Space Marine chapters, millions of guard troops, and the full industrial output of major Forge worlds have been committed to the Third War for Armageddon, and they still can't decisively win. Gazg-Kul's green tide continues to grow, continues to spread, continues to draw more Orks from across the galaxy like a lodestone pulling in iron filings. Every battle makes the Orks stronger. Every defeated war boss releases spores that grow into more Orks. Every temporary victory for the Imperium is just a delay, or buying time for reinforcements that might not arrive before the next assault begins. And Gazg-Kul isn't the only sign of Ork evolution. Across the galaxy, other war bosses are rising, who display similar sophistication. Some speak of visions similar to Gazg-Kul's. Some demonstrate strategic thinking beyond typical Ork capability. Some grow larger than they should, faster than they should, as if their genetic code is responding to some external pressure or signal. The Gestalt field is strengthening. The conditions that created the beast are returning, and at the center of it all is the Prophet, the largest, strongest, smartest Ork in the galaxy, who continues to grow more powerful with each passing year and each resurrection. Gazg-Kul may not fully understand what he represents, but he probably doesn't consciously recognize that he's becoming more like the Krork with each death and rebirth. But the Gestalt field knows. The genetic code knows. And somewhere deep in the collective unconscious of every Ork everywhere, there's a growing awareness that something is changing, that the time of crude simplicity is ending, that the age of the true green tide is approaching. The Imperium has faced many threats over its long history. It has survived chaos incursions, Tyranid hive fleets, Necron tomb awakening, and Eldar raids. It has weathered heresies, civil wars, and the loss of half its territory to the Great Rift. But it has never faced what's coming if Gazg-Kul succeeds in his vision. It has never faced an Ork race that remembers its heritage. that accesses its full potential, that fights with the sophistication of the Krork while retaining the endless enthusiasm and fearlessness of the Orks. That threat would make every previous crisis look manageable by comparison. The prophet grows stronger, the Gestalt field grows stronger, and the galaxy, unknowingly, approaches the brink of a transformation that could reshape the balance of power forever. The breaking point. Conditions for awakening. Understanding when and how Orks might collectively realize their true potential requires examining the specific conditions that trigger the activation of dormant Krork genetic sequences. This isn't a spontaneous process. The old ones didn't design the Krork to randomly evolve into super warriors without external pressure. They created a species that would respond to specific environmental triggers, adapting to challenges by accessing more sophisticated programming embedded in their DNA. The primary trigger is conflict intensity. Orks grow throughout their lives, but they grow faster and larger when they're fighting frequently against dangerous opponents. This isn't just physical exercise building muscle mass. The Gestalt field actually accelerates their development when they're in environments that match the conditions the Krork were designed for. Constant warfare against powerful enemies. An Ork who spends years fighting space marines will grow larger and tougher than an Ork who only fights weaker species, even if both survive an equal number of battles. This principle extends beyond individual growth to species-wide evolution. When large numbers of Orks are simultaneously engaged in intense conflict, the Gestalt field begins activating more sophisticated genetic programming across the entire population in that region. This is why the Orks during the War of the Beast were so much more dangerous than typical green tides. They weren't just numerous, they were actively fighting the most desperate war in Imperial history, facing challenges that required them to be smarter, tougher, and more organized to survive. The second trigger is population density and unity of purpose. The Gestalt field's power increases exponentially with the number of Orks in close proximity. But it's not just about having lots of Orks in one place. Those Orks need to be working toward a common goal, focused on a shared objective. Yet 1 million Orks fighting each other in tribal warfare don't create the same Gestalt field effect as 1 million Orks united under a single warboss to conquer a specific planet. The unity of purpose creates coherence in the Gestalt field, allowing it to affect reality more strongly than it could, with the same number of Orks pulling in different directions. This is why the beast was so dangerous. The 6 prime Orks managed to unite Orks across hundreds of systems under a single banner with a single goal: conquering the Imperium. That level of unity, maintained across such a vast number of Orks, created a Gestalt field of unprecedented power. Individual Orks grew larger just by being part of that unified force. Mech boys could build technology far more sophisticated than they should have been able to, because the Gestalt field was smoothing over inconsistencies and making marginal designs function perfectly. Even Ork boys displayed tactical sophistication because the field was connecting them all to the strategic thinking of their leaders. The third trigger, and perhaps the most critical, is knowledge propagation through the Gestalt field. When one Ork learns something significant, that knowledge can spread to other Orks through the field, especially if it's knowledge related to warfare, technology, or survival. This doesn't happen instantly or perfectly. It's more like an idea gradually infecting a population, growing stronger as more individuals pick it up and incorporate it into their own behavior. But given enough time and the right conditions, a single Ork's innovation or insight can transform the behavior of billions. This is where the concept of Orks remembering their power becomes dangerous. What if a single Ork, perhaps through head injury, genetic mutation, or simple random chance, accessed deep Krork genetic memories? What if that Ork suddenly understood, really understood, what the Gestalt field could do if properly focused? That knowledge wouldn't stay locked in one head. Through the Gestalt field, it would begin propagating to other Orks, slowly at first, affecting those closest to the source. then faster, spreading through the Gestalt network like a virus, reaching more Orks, strengthening as it went. We can model how this might happen by looking at historical examples. We'll consider what occurs when a particularly innovative mech boy figures out a new design. That design starts appearing in other mech boy workshops across the sector within years, even among mech boys who have never met the inventor and have no physical way to have learned about the innovation. The Gestalt field is facilitating knowledge transfer below the level of conscious awareness. The mech boys don't know they're copying someone else's design. They just have an instinct that this configuration of parts will work better than alternatives. Now scale that up to knowledge about the Gestalt field itself. Imagine Gazkul, during one of his visions, fully comprehending what he represents. Imagine him understanding that he's becoming a Krork, that the potential for that transformation exists in every Ork, and that the Gestalt field can be deliberately focused to accelerate the process. That understanding, that moment of clarity, would immediately begin propagating through the Gestalt field to other Orks. At first, the effects would be subtle. War bosses across the galaxy might find themselves having similar visions, similar insights, without understanding where these thoughts came from. Mech boys might start building more sophisticated technology without consciously deciding to do so. Ork boys might begin coordinating better, fighting smarter, displaying tactical awareness that they couldn't articulate if asked about it. These wouldn't be dramatic changes initially. They'd be small improvements, incremental enhancements that could easily be dismissed as normal Ork variation. But the Gestalt field has a feedback loop property. As more Orks access more sophisticated behavior, the field itself grows stronger. Stronger fields trigger more genetic activation in more Orks. More genetic activation makes the field even stronger. The process accelerates, each step feeding the next, creating an exponential growth curve that starts slow but rapidly becomes unstoppable. The tipping point, the moment when the process becomes irreversible, probably occurs when a certain percentage of the total Ork population has activated enough Krork genetics to display obviously enhanced capabilities. The exact percentage is unknown, but we can estimate based on the War of the Beast. 6 prime Orks managed to elevate millions of normal Orks toward Krork-level capability. If we assume that ratio holds, then perhaps 1 prime Ork per million normal Orks is sufficient to trigger mass elevation. With billions of Orks in the galaxy, that means you'd need thousands of prime Orks to trigger total species-wide awakening. That sounds like a lot until you consider that Gazakul is already prime Ork level and growing stronger. Other war bosses are showing signs of similar enhancement. The largest green tides in history are currently active across multiple sectors. The conditions for mass genetic activation are not just present, they're intensifying with each passing year. We might be witnessing the early stages of exactly the exponential growth curve that leads to catastrophic awakening. There's also a temporal component to consider. The genetic programming the old ones installed wasn't designed to trigger instantly. Krork were meant to develop throughout their lives, accessing more sophisticated capabilities as they aged and faced greater challenges. An Ork who lives longer, fights more battles, and grows larger has more time for genetic activation to occur. In the 41st millennium, with constant warfare providing endless opportunities for combat, Ork war bosses are living longer than they have in millennia. They're growing larger, smarter, and more dangerous because they're surviving long enough for more of their genetic potential to express itself. Gazkul, who has now been resurrected multiple times and has effective immortality as long as Mad Dog Grotznik survives to rebuild him, might live indefinitely. Each decade he survives is another decade for genetic sequences to activate. Each century could see him approach closer to true Krork status. And through the Gestalt field, his development influences every Ork everywhere, gradually pulling the entire species along the same evolutionary trajectory. The final trigger that could push Orks over the edge into full awakening is a sufficiently powerful external threat. The Krork were designed to fight Necrons and Citan, enemies of godlike power, who could destroy stars and shatter planets. Facing such threats required the Krork to access their full potential just to survive. In the 41st millennium, such threats exist again. The Tyranids represent an existential danger to all life in the galaxy. The Necrons are awakening from their 60 million year sleep. Chaos incursions threaten to tear reality apart. If Orks were to face any of these threats in sufficient numbers and intensity, the pressure might trigger emergency genetic activation across the entire species. The Gestalt field, responding to the need for maximum combat effectiveness, could potentially activate all Krork programming simultaneously across billions of Orks. This would be the worst-case scenario from everyone else's perspective. Orks transforming into Krork not gradually over decades, but rapidly over months, driven by the biological imperative to become what they were always meant to be. Every faction in the galaxy should fear this possibility. The Imperium barely survived the War of the Beast with 6 prime Orks. The Eldar remember the Krork from the War in Heaven and know exactly how dangerous they were. The Tau, despite their technological sophistication, would be overwhelmed by Krork, who combine Ork numbers with actual strategic thinking. Even the Tyranids, who rely on numerical superiority, would struggle against an enemy that breeds just as fast, but fights with actual organization and technology. The conditions for Ork awakening are not distant possibilities or unlikely scenarios. They exist right now, growing stronger every day. The Gestalt field is more powerful than it's been since the War of the Beast. Ork populations are larger than ever. The largest and most sophisticated Ork war boss since the Beast himself continues to grow in power and influence. And the galaxy burns with conflicts that provide exactly the kind of pressure that triggers Ork evolution. The question isn't whether these conditions will eventually trigger mass genetic activation. Well, the question is whether anyone will recognize the warning signs before it's too late to stop it. And given the Imperium's track record of ignoring previous warnings, the answer is probably not. The first days. When the green tide remembers. Picture the moment of awakening. It doesn't happen all at once, not like a light switch being flipped. Instead, imagine a wave starting from a single point and spreading outward through the Gestalt field at the speed of thought. The origin point could be Gaz-Kul during one of his visions, finally understanding the full scope of what he's becoming. It could be a weird boy, their psychic senses allowing them to perceive the Gestalt field directly, suddenly seeing patterns that have always been there but never been noticed. It could even be a random Ork boy, as some genetic quirk or combination of environmental factors causing dormant Krork sequences to activate in a moment of unexpected clarity. The first Ork to truly remember doesn't announce their realization with words. Orks aren't particularly verbal about internal experiences. Instead, they act on their new understanding immediately and instinctively. A mech boy who suddenly comprehends the full potential of the Gestalt field doesn't write papers or give lectures. They start building, hands moving with uncharacteristic precision, assembling technology that looks simpler than it is, that shouldn't work according to Imperial engineering principles, but works better than anything the Mechanicus could produce. The constructions that emerge from this awakened mech's workshop are different. They're still recognizably Orky, while still loud and violent and painted in bright colors. But they're also elegant in ways that Ork technology normally isn't. The power flows smoothly, the ammunition feeds reliably. The force fields are stable. Most critically, when other Orks pick up these weapons and vehicles, they can feel the difference. The Gestalt field resonates with these creations in ways that normal Ork tech doesn't, creating a feedback loop that makes both the technology and the Orks using it more effective. Other mech boys notice. They don't understand consciously what's different, but the Gestalt field carries impressions, feelings, instincts. When they return to their own workshops, their hands move in slightly different patterns. They make design choices that they can't fully articulate, guided by something deeper than conscious thought. Within weeks, improved designs start appearing across the planet. Within months, they spread to neighboring systems. The knowledge propagates through the gestalt field like ripples spreading across a pond. Meanwhile, the orc who first awakened continues to change. Their body responds to the genetic activation, growing faster than normal orc development would explain. Height increases by inches per day rather than per year. Muscle mass builds in visible increments. The skull thickens, the jaw strengthens, the tusks grow longer and sharper. This isn't puberty or natural aging. This is genetic programming activating in response to environmental triggers, rebuilding the orc according to blueprints laid down by the old ones 60 million years ago. The mental changes are even more dramatic. Thoughts that were simple before gain complexity and nuance. A strategic thinking that extended only to the next battle suddenly encompasses months or years. Language centers in the brain develop rapidly, transforming crude orcish speech into something more articulate, more precise, more capable of expressing complex concepts. The awakened orc doesn't become less orky. They become more completely what an orc was always meant to be. A perfect warrior with the physical capability to win any fight, and the mental capacity to choose which fights are worth winning. As more orcs begin accessing their Krork heritage, the changes compound. The gestalt field, strengthened by each awakened orc, accelerates the awakening of others. What started as isolated incidents across scattered worlds becomes a growing wave of transformation. Orc war bosses, who were already large and dangerous, suddenly double in size within months, their power armor having to be constantly rebuilt to accommodate their expanding frames. Weird boys channel gestalt field energy with unprecedented precision. Their psychic powers no longer the dangerous, barely controlled explosions of energy, but focused weapons that can be aimed and modulated. The effects on orc society are immediate and profound. Tribes that spent most of their time fighting each other suddenly find those fights becoming more purposeful, more organized. They're still violent, still brutal, but now there's structure beneath the chaos. War bosses who would normally compete for dominance start coordinating instead, not because they like each other, but because the gestalt field makes clear that cooperation achieves better results. Or the biggest war boss in a region doesn't have to constantly fight to maintain position. The field itself communicates their status, and other orcs instinctively defer without needing to be beaten into submission. Orc technology undergoes a renaissance. Mech boys who previously built through trial and error, cobbling together whatever worked and hoping the gestalt field would make up for design flaws, suddenly understand the principles underlying their creations. They can predict what will work before building it. They can design for specific purposes rather than just making things shooty or choppy. Most importantly, they can teach, though teaching is too formal a word for what actually happens. The knowledge flows through the gestalt field, from awakened mechs to every other mech boy in range, propagating across the orc network like updates to an organic computer system. Vehicles that roll off mech boy assembly lines aren't just improved versions of existing designs, they're revolutionary in scope. A battle wagon built by an awakened mech doesn't just carry orc boys into battle, it has functioning shock absorption, improving accuracy for the weapons mounted on it. The armor is layered, deflecting shots rather than just absorbing them. The engine runs smoothly instead of belching smoke and threatening to explode. And most troubling from an enemy's perspective, multiple vehicles built by different mech boys can coordinate their movements, supporting each other in ways that suggest actual tactical doctrine rather than just independent groups of orcs getting in range and shooting. For the Imperium, the first signs of widespread orc awakening would be subtle enough to dismiss. Reports from planetary governors and guard commanders would mention unusual orc behavior, but unusual for orcs covers a wide range of possibilities. A report saying the orcs are more organized than usual gets filed with hundreds of similar reports from other war zones. The bureaucracy that governs the Imperium isn't built to respond quickly to gradual changes. It's designed to handle clear threats and known problems, and orcs becoming slightly more dangerous doesn't trigger emergency protocols. The Space Marines, with their longer institutional memory and better access to historical records, might notice faster. Chapter masters who have fought orcs for decades would recognize that something fundamental is changing. Orc tactics that used to be predictable become harder to counter. Weapons that used to be crude but manageable become genuinely dangerous. War bosses who should have fallen to established assassination strategies survive through unexpected sophistication in their defenses. These aren't isolated incidents confined to one war zone. They're patterns emerging across multiple sectors simultaneously. But even the Space Marines, with all their experience and training, wouldn't immediately recognize what they're seeing as the beginning of Krork resurgence. They've never fought Krork. The War of the Beast is recorded history, studied in monastery libraries, but history doesn't capture the full horror of facing prime orcs in battle. The current generation of Space Marines might intellectually understand that orcs used to be more dangerous, but understanding something academically is different from experiencing it viscerally. The Eldar would know. They remember the war in heaven, not personally but through their racial memory and the songs of their farseers. When the Eldar start seeing orcs growing larger, fighting smarter, building more sophisticated technology, they recognize immediately what those signs mean. The Krork are returning. Not in the distant future as some theoretical possibility, but now, today, across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. The Eldar response would be immediate and desperate. They cannot allow the Krork to fully awaken. Not now, not when the Eldar race is a shadow of its former glory, when their gods are dead or imprisoned, when they lack the resources and numbers to fight a war of that magnitude. The Eldar would strike at every emerging prime orc they could identify, using every assassination technique at their disposal, sacrificing aspect warriors and guardians in suicidal attacks just to eliminate orcs who show signs of approaching Krork status. And it wouldn't be enough, because the Gestalt field doesn't have a single point of failure. Killing awakened orcs slows the spread, but doesn't stop it. The knowledge is already in the Gestalt field, already propagating, already infecting more orcs every day. Each awakened orc who dies releases spores that carry genetic material already activated toward Krork expression. Those spores grow into orcs who start larger and develop faster than their predecessors. The evolution isn't just spreading horizontally through the current generation, but vertically through successive generations being born with more active Krork genes. Within a year of the first awakening, multiple sectors would report orc activity that seems qualitatively different from normal green tides. The orcs aren't just raiding anymore, they're conquering with intent, holding ground, establishing permanent structures, and showing every sign of planning to stay. Their attacks hit Imperial supply lines and command centers with precision, suggesting actual intelligence gathering. Their retreats are orderly, preserving forces for future battles rather than simply fleeing in chaos. Every engagement teaches them something, and they apply those lessons in subsequent fights. Within 2 years, the first new prime orcs would emerge. Oh, not 6 this time, dozens, maybe hundreds, each commanding a legion of orcs who benefit from their leaders' enhanced capabilities through the strengthened Gestalt field. These new prime orcs wouldn't be identical to the Beast and his fellows. They'd be products of the 41st Millennium, reflecting the diversity of orc clans and the specific conditions under which they awakened. A Goth prime orc would be a close combat monster, standing 12 meters tall in power armor covered in spikes and trophies. An Evil Sun's prime orc would be marginally smaller, but just as deadly, leading bike hordes that move with impossible speed and coordination. Within 3 years, the Imperium would be losing. Not in every theater, not on every world, but overall. The strategic picture would show green tide marks spreading across Imperial star charts, each one representing not a temporary orc incursion, but permanent orc conquest. Worlds that had stood against orcs for centuries would fall in months. Fortress worlds would hold longer but eventually succumb as the orcs learnt their defenses and adapted accordingly. Even Space Marine homeworlds would come under threat from orc forces led by prime orcs who could match chapter masters in personal combat while commanding vastly superior numbers. And through it all, The Gestalt field would grow stronger, feeding back on itself, accelerating the awakening process with each passing month. Orcs who were born or who grew from spores after the awakening began would never know what it was like to be the degraded version of their species. They'd be born already, accessing a significant portion of their Krork heritage, growing faster, thinking more clearly, understanding technology instinctively. Each generation would be more Krork than Orc, until the distinction became meaningless and the galaxy had to accept a terrifying truth. The most successful warrior race ever created had returned, and no one could stop them. This is what the first days of awakening would look like. Not dramatic explosions of power, but a gradually accelerating transformation that seems manageable until it's far too late to do anything about it. The green tide rises. Immediate consequences. The first planetary system to fall completely to an awakened Orc force would serve as a template for what was coming. Not because the Orcs planned it that way, but because once they accessed their full potential, their approach to conquest became consistent across different warbands. As the system chosen doesn't particularly matter. Let's call it Meridian, an imperial system with 5 inhabited worlds, 3 forge moons, and a naval base that served as a staging ground for crusades into surrounding sectors. The attack wouldn't start with the traditional Orc approach of just appearing in-system, with as many ships as could be scraped together and heading for the nearest world. Awakened Orcs understand the value of intelligence gathering and preparation. Scout vessels, small and fast enough to avoid detection, would survey the system for weeks before the main force arrived. They'd identify military installations, supply depots, communication networks, and most critically, the reaction time for reinforcements from neighboring systems. When the main Orc fleet arrived, whilst it wouldn't be the chaotic mass of mismatched vessels that Imperial forces expected, the ships would still look Orky, still be loud and violent and painted in bright colors, but they'd move with purpose and coordination. The fleet would divide into designated battle groups, each assigned specific objectives rather than just heading for whatever target looked most fun. Some would engage the Imperial Navy vessels defending the system, not to destroy them immediately, but to tie them up and prevent them from interfering with planetary landings. Others would strike at the Forge Moons, recognizing their importance to the system's defenses. And the largest group would head for the primary hive world, where billions of Imperial citizens could be conquered and put to use supporting the Orc war machine. The orbital bombardment phase. Traditionally, a chaotic affair where Orcs just fired at whatever caught their attention would be precisely targeted. Weapons platforms and defense satellites would be priority targets, eliminated with efficient violence. Communications infrastructure would be systematically destroyed to prevent calls for help from reaching outside the system. The Orcs would even target specific sections of planetary defense shields, concentrating fire on weak points identified during the reconnaissance phase, creating gaps through which dropships and landing craft could pass. The actual planetary assault would showcase the fundamental shift in Orc capability. Waves of drop pods and landing craft would descend through the gaps in planetary defenses, but instead of spreading out randomly, they'd concentrate on strategically valuable objectives. Or spaceports would be captured intact when possible, giving the Orcs immediate access to landing zones for heavier equipment. Garrison command centers would be priority targets, their destruction decapitating planetary defense coordination. Critical infrastructure like power plants and water treatment facilities would be seized rather than destroyed, because awakened Orcs understand that conquered worlds are more useful when their infrastructure survives. The ground combat itself would be where the true horror of facing awakened Orcs became apparent. Imperial Guard regiments trained to fight typical Orc mobs would find themselves facing an enemy that used cover, coordinated fire, and actually maintained formation. Orc boys wouldn't just charge forward screaming, they'd advance in overlapping waves, in the front ranks drawing fire, while subsequent waves maneuvered to hit Imperial positions from multiple angles. When Imperial forces tried to fall back to prepared defensive positions, they'd find Orc forces already there, having infiltrated through routes the Imperials didn't think large orcs could fit through. The psychological impact on Imperial defenders would be devastating. Soldiers trained to fight enemies whose tactics they understand. They learn how Space Marines fight, how Chaos cultists attack, how Tyranids swarm. They know what to expect from orcs, crude but numerous, charging forward with more enthusiasm than sense, relying on numbers and durability to overcome superior Imperial tactics and technology. When that fundamental assumption proves false, also when the enemy starts demonstrating genuine tactical acumen while maintaining their traditional advantages in numbers and physical resilience, morale collapses. Officers trying to coordinate the defense would find their traditional anti-orc strategies failing. Concentrate fire on the war boss. The orcs have learned to use body doubles and decoys, forcing Imperial forces to waste ammunition on false targets, while the real leader directs the battle from a secured position. Target their heavy weapons. The orcs have distributed their firepower across multiple units rather than concentrating it in obvious places. Cut off their supply lines. The orcs are living off the land and captured Imperial stockpiles, showing no signs of the ammunition shortages that normally limited their offensive operations. Space Marine intervention, the traditional solution to orc incursions that conventional forces couldn't handle, would buy time but not achieve the decisive results that Imperial commanders expected. A Space Marine chapter deploying to Meridian would certainly kill thousands of orcs. Power-armored warriors are still more than a match for individual orc boys, even when those boys are fighting smarter. But the fundamental calculus of Space Marine warfare, where a few hundred elite warriors could break an orc horde's momentum, no longer holds when the orcs are led by prime orcs who match chapter masters in personal combat and command forces that don't break and run, even when losing. The appearance of a prime orc on the battlefield would be the moment when Imperial forces realized they weren't just facing a particularly successful green tide, but something fundamentally different. These weren't degraded orcs who had forgotten their heritage. These were the beginning of the Krork's return, and nothing in Imperial military doctrine prepared commanders for that reality. The prime orc, standing 12 meters tall in power armor that incorporated technology the Mechanicus would take decades to reverse engineer, would be immediately recognizable as the supreme threat on the battlefield. But killing them wouldn't be the straightforward task that eliminating a typical war boss represented. They'd be protected by veterans who could actually execute defensive tactics, as surrounded by force fields that didn't flicker and fail, but maintained consistent strength, equipped with weapons that could threaten even Terminators at range. A typical Space Marine approach would be to deploy assault Terminators teleporting directly into close combat range, where their thunder hammers and storm shields would make short work of orc leadership. Against a prime orc, that strategy would result in the Terminators being slaughtered. The prime orc would see them coming, the Gestalt field giving them awareness of teleportation signatures that normal orcs couldn't detect. They'd be prepared, with heavy weapons positioned to fire on the arrival point, with veteran knobs ready to engage in close combat, much with the prime orc themselves moving to intercept in ways that demonstrated genuine understanding of Space Marine combat doctrine. If the Terminators managed to engage the prime orc directly, they'd find themselves fighting an opponent who matched or exceeded them in strength and durability while possessing superior reach and weaponry. A power fist from a Terminator is deadly. A power claw from a prime orc is worse, larger, stronger, and wielded by someone who instinctively understands the weak points in Terminator armor, because the Krork fought similar enemies during the War in Heaven. Within weeks of their arrival, the Orks would control Meridian's system completely. The Imperial Navy ships would be destroyed or fleeing. The Forge Moons would be captured, their Mechanicus overseers dead or imprisoned, as their facilities repurposed to produce Ork weapons and equipment, with the same efficiency they previously showed in Imperial service. The hive worlds would be conquered, their populations not slaughtered wholesale, but organized into labor forces. Because awakened orcs understand something their degraded descendants forgot. Productive slaves are more useful than dead enemies. The fall of Meridian would be repeated across hundreds of systems simultaneously. Because the awakening wasn't localized to one region, it was spreading through the entire orc population simultaneously via the Gestalt field, triggering transformation wherever sufficient numbers of orcs gathered. Every major green tide suddenly became more dangerous. Every orc-held world suddenly became harder to reconquer. And every day, more orcs accessed more of their heritage, is making them collectively stronger and more sophisticated. The Imperium's response would be hampered by the very factors that usually made it powerful. The vast bureaucracy that governed humanity's stellar empire couldn't adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Reports of orc enhancement would flow up through layers of administration, each layer filtering and categorizing based on previous experience and established doctrine. By the time accurate information reached the High Lords of Terror, it would be months out of date and buried under mountains of other reports competing for attention. The Space Marine chapters, more autonomous and capable of rapid response, would be the first to recognize the full scope of the threat. But there are only about 1,000 chapters, and even if every single one deployed all their forces simultaneously, that would be roughly 1 million Space Marines to defend 1 million worlds. The numbers simply don't work. The Imperium relies on the Guard for its actual military might, and Guard regiments weren't equipped or trained to fight an enemy that combined orc numbers with actual sophistication. The Adeptus Mechanicus would try to understand orc technology enhancement through their established scientific frameworks and fail completely. They'd capture examples of the new orc weapons and vehicles, disassemble them in sealed laboratories, and find that the components were indeed more sophisticated than previous orc technology, but still used principles the Mechanicus couldn't fully explain. The Gestalt field influence on technology wouldn't show up in their analysis because they were looking for mechanical explanations rather than psychic ones. And through it all, the Gestalt field would continue to strengthen, continue to spread, continue to activate more Krork genetic programming in more orcs across the galaxy. The exponential growth curve that started slow would accelerate, each month bringing more dramatic changes than the last, until the tipping point was reached and the transformation became irreversible. The orcs would remember. They would become what they always had the potential to become, and the galaxy would burn in green fire. The galaxy burns. Strategic analysis. From a strategic perspective, awakened orcs represent a threat that no single faction can successfully oppose. This isn't hyperbole or dramatic storytelling. It's the result of analyzing the fundamental advantages that made the Krork successful during the War in Heaven, and applying those advantages to the current galactic situation. The math is brutal and unforgiving, and every possible defensive strategy runs into problems that can't be solved through superior technology, better tactics, or even divine intervention. Start with the numbers. Orcs already outnumber humanity, and humanity outnumbers every other sentient species in the galaxy. The Imperium controls roughly 1 million worlds, each with populations ranging from millions to hundreds of billions. Total human population across all Imperial worlds is somewhere in the quadrillions, an almost incomprehensible number that represents humanity's single greatest advantage over their enemies. Against Tyranids or Necrons or Chaos incursions, that numerical advantage is critical. The Imperium can sustain horrific casualties and still have reserves to commit, because they simply have more people to throw into the meat grinder. Orcs outnumber humans, not by a small margin, but by potentially an order of magnitude or more. Every world the orcs have ever touched carries their spores, which means every one of those worlds is actively producing more orcs, even decades or centuries after the original infestation was supposedly cleared. Orcs grow to maturity in years rather than the decades required for humans. They don't need families or upbringing or education. A spore becomes a squig or snotling or Gretchen or orc boy, depending on environmental factors, and that process completes itself automatically without any adult supervision required. More critically, killing orcs produces more orcs. Every dead orc releases spores. Every battlefield becomes a breeding ground. The Imperium's traditional strategy of overwhelming orc forces through superior firepower and accepting high casualties in the process actually makes the long-term orc problem worse. Each crusade that successfully purges an orc-held world leaves behind billions of spores that will grow into new orcs as soon as Imperial attention shifts elsewhere. The only way to truly eliminate orcs from a world is sustained occupation combined with intense chemical and thermal purges, repeated over years or decades, and the Imperium doesn't have the resources to do that while simultaneously defending against other threats. Now add awakening to this already nightmarish scenario. Awakened orcs aren't just more dangerous individually, they reproduce just as fast as degraded orcs, but each new generation starts with more active Krork genetics. Spores released by prime orcs grow into orcs who are already larger, tougher, and smarter than typical orc boys. These enhanced boys release enhanced spores when they die. The genetic improvements propagate and amplify with each generation, creating an evolutionary pressure cooker that produces increasingly Krork-like offspring. Within a decade of full awakening, you'd have billions of orcs across the galaxy who never knew what it was like to be the degraded version of their species. These wouldn't be orcs slowly evolving toward Krork. They'd be Krork, born with active, sophisticated genetic programming, developing the full suite of capabilities that made their ancestors the dominant warrior race of the War in Heaven. And they'd keep multiplying exponentially with nothing to slow them down. The military implications are apocalyptic. Consider logistics, the mundane but critical factor that determines military success. The Imperium runs on logistics. Every Imperial Guard regiment requires food, water, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Every Space Marine chapter needs gene seed, power armor components, bolter ammunition, and promethium for their vehicles. The Adeptus Mechanicus can't produce weapons without raw materials, manufacturing facilities, and energy. The Imperial Navy consumes truly staggering quantities of fuel and supplies just to keep their ships operational. Cut the logistics, and Imperial military power collapses within months as forces run out of ammunition and supplies. Orcs don't have this vulnerability. They can eat anything, including each other, and their own dead if necessary. They can synthesize ammunition from scrap metal and local chemicals. Their vehicles run on fuel so crude that Imperial engines would destroy themselves trying to burn it. They can manufacture their own weapons in ad hoc workshops, using salvaged materials, and while the resulting products might not match Imperial quality in normal circumstances, the Gestalt field makes up the difference. And awakened orcs, with access to sophisticated Krork technology, would produce weapons and vehicles that don't just match, but exceed Imperial equivalents. This means orcs can campaign indefinitely without supply lines. They can operate in regions of space where the Imperium would struggle to maintain forces. They can take and hold worlds that the Imperium would abandon as economically unviable. Every battle makes them stronger because they scavenge enemy equipment, consume enemy dead for biomass, and spread spores that will produce more orcs. They can lose engagements, even lose worlds. And it doesn't cripple their overall war effort because they regenerate losses faster than any other faction. Now consider the strategic picture. The Imperium is already stretched desperately thin across its million worlds. Guard regiments rotate between combat zones based on threat assessment, with responses often arriving months or years after the initial distress calls. Space Marine chapters operate independently, choosing which threats to address based on their own strategic assessment and cultural priorities. The Imperial Navy tries to maintain secure shipping lanes, but has nowhere near enough ships to protect every system simultaneously. The entire structure relies on most worlds being safe most of the time, allowing concentration of forces when and where they're needed. Awakened orcs would shatter this entire defensive strategy. If every orc-occupied world suddenly became an active threat requiring immediate response, the Imperium couldn't possibly address them all. There aren't enough guard regiments, Space Marine chapters, or Navy ships to mount simultaneous offensives against hundreds or thousands of orc strongholds. The Imperium would be forced to choose which worlds to defend and which to abandon, and that choice would would get harder every year as more worlds fell to green tides that couldn't be stopped. The economic impact would be catastrophic even before military defeat became inevitable. The Imperium's war economy is already operating at near maximum capacity, with forge worlds producing weapons and equipment as fast as possible to meet demand from guard regiments fighting across 1,000 battlefronts. Losing multiple forge worlds to Ork conquest would create immediate shortages. Regiments would run out of replacement equipment. Space Marine chapters would struggle to repair damaged power armor. The Navy would have to ration ammunition for ship weapons. Every loss would compound previous losses, creating a death spiral where military weakness led to more defeats, which led to greater weakness. And the Orks would be capturing that infrastructure intact. Awakened Orks understand the value of industrial capacity. They wouldn't destroy forge worlds. They'd capture them and put them back in operation, producing Ork equipment. Every tank factory that previously armed the Imperial Guard would be producing more battle wagons and Gorkanauts. Every weapons facility would switch to producing Ork shooters and choppers. Every shipyard would start building Ork warships. The Imperium wouldn't just be losing productive capacity, they'd be watching that capacity turn against them. The Space Marines, humanity's elite warriors, would be completely overwhelmed. There are approximately 1 million Space Marines spread across about 1,000 chapters. That sounds impressive, until you recognize that Prime Orks match or exceed chapter masters in personal combat capability. If even 1% of Orks reached Prime status, that's hundreds of thousands of Prime Orks, maybe millions, each commanding legions of awakened Orks who fight with coordination and discipline while maintaining traditional Ork advantages in numbers and durability. A Space Marine chapter, responding to an Ork threat, would find themselves fighting a force that included multiple Prime Orks, hundreds of Nob veterans who could challenge Space Marines in close combat, and thousands of Ork boys who used cover and tactics instead of just charging forward, screaming. The Space Marines would kill Orks by the hundreds, maybe thousands, but they'd eventually be overwhelmed through attrition and killed or forced to retreat. Each chapter lost would be a catastrophic blow to Imperial military capability that would take centuries to replace, assuming the Imperium survived long enough to rebuild. The Emperor's Tarot, the divination system used by the Imperium's highest authorities to predict future threats, would show nothing but green cards and disaster imagery. Farseers across every craft world would see the same apocalyptic visions. The Tau, who pride themselves on rational strategic planning, would run probability calculations and find that every scenario resulted in eventual Ork dominance. Even the Necrons, with their godlike technology and millions of years of experience, would recognize that fighting fully awakened Krork would require committing forces they couldn't spare while still addressing other threats to their remaining tomb worlds. The Tyranids represent possibly the only faction that might slow the Orks down, and even that's uncertain. Tyranids would recognize Ork biomass as valuable and attack Ork-held worlds with characteristic single-minded hunger. Orks would relish the opportunity to fight an enemy that never retreats and never surrenders. The resulting conflicts would be among the largest battles the galaxy has ever seen, with billions or trillions of combatants on both sides. Worlds turned into charnel houses of green and purple bodies stacked like cordwood. But here's the terrifying calculation. Tyranids need to consume biomass to reproduce. Orks produce biomass faster than it can be consumed as long as any survive to release spores. Every Ork killed by Tyranids releases spores that will grow into more Orks. Every battlefield becomes an Ork breeding ground. Unless the Tyranids can achieve complete biological sterility of killing every single Ork and burning every single spore, they're just fighting an enemy that grows back faster than they can eat it. And awakened Orks would be smart enough to actively defend their spore fields and breeding grounds rather than leaving them unprotected. The best-case scenario, from the Imperium's perspective, is probably mutual destruction, where Orks and Tyranids grind each other down across decades of total war, depleting both populations to the point where neither remains a galaxy-spanning threat. But achieving even that outcome would require the Imperium to somehow manipulate both xenospecies into fighting each other while avoiding getting caught in the middle. And the Imperium has neither the intelligence infrastructure nor the political unity to execute such a complex strategy successfully. The worst-case scenario, the one that military strategists should be losing sleep over, is that awakened orcs and tyranids don't fight to mutual exhaustion, but instead achieve a kind of equilibrium. Orcs provide tyranids with endless biomass to consume. Tyranids provide orcs with endless worthy opponents to fight. The galaxy becomes a three-way war between orcs, tyranids, and everyone else, with the third category diminishing rapidly as the first two consume everything in their path. That's the strategic reality of awakened orcs. No defensive strategy works, because orcs can replace losses faster than they can be inflicted. No offensive strategy works because there's no center of gravity to attack. No single point whose elimination would cripple the orc war effort. And no alliance strategy works, because no combination of factions has the resources to simultaneously fight orcs everywhere they exist. The mathematics of exponential growth, combined with the biological resilience of a species designed by gods to be unkillable, creates an enemy that simply can't be defeated through conventional means. The final vision, what victory looks like. In the end, after decades or centuries of war, after the last imperial strongholds have fallen and the final Space Marine chapters have been overrun, after the Eldar have fled to the Webway and sealed the gates behind them, after the Tau Empire has been reduced to a few desperately defended worlds, after even the Tyranids have been driven back by sheer persistent violence, the galaxy would belong to the Orks. Not through subtle conquest or political manipulation or religious conversion, through the simple application of overwhelming military force applied consistently across every world simultaneously until no organized resistance remained. The Orks wouldn't need to kill every non-Ork in the galaxy. They'd just need to establish military dominance so complete that resistance became pointless. Then put the survivors to work, supporting the Ork war machine. What would that galaxy look like? Strange as it seems, it might actually be more peaceful in some ways than the current 41st millennium. Not because orcs suddenly become pacifists, but because fully awakened orcs understand that eternal war requires sustainable opponents. They wouldn't exterminate conquered species because doing so would eliminate future enemies to fight. Instead, they'd establish a kind of enforced equilibrium where human worlds paid tribute and provided resources, but were left functionally autonomous as long as they complied. The Ork gods, Gork and Mork, exist in the warp as reflections of Ork collective consciousness. With billions of fully awakened Orks all accessing their Krork heritage, those gods would grow more powerful than they've been since the War in Heaven. They might achieve a level of reality warping influence that rivals the Chaos gods, but focused on warfare and cunning, rather than corruption and excess. The warp itself might take on a greenish tinge in regions where Ork populations are densest, the gestalt field bleeding through from the material realm and changing the nature of the immaterium itself. Human survivors would adapt, because humans always adapt. But within a few generations, living under Ork rule would become normal. Children would grow up knowing nothing else, learning to speak Orkish alongside their own languages, navigating the brutal but surprisingly straightforward hierarchy that Ork society imposed. Life would be violent, dangerous, and short by modern standards, but not necessarily worse than life in the Imperium had been for the vast majority of humanity. At least under Ork rule, there'd be no tithes of psychers to feed the Emperor's corpse throne, no pointless religious crusades, no inquisitors burning people for imagined heresies. Some human societies might even thrive in strange ways. The Orks would need technical specialists to maintain infrastructure they couldn't be bothered with. Human engineers, doctors, administrators, and teachers would be valuable commodities in an Ork-dominated galaxy, protected and even privileged in their communities because their skills were useful. A class of human collaborators would emerge, working directly for Ork war bosses, translating Ork desires into effective governance of human populations. The Space Marines, or what remained of them, would face a choice that would tear their chapters apart. Some would refuse to surrender, fighting to the last bolt round in pointless gestures of defiance that achieved nothing except their own extinction. Others would recognize reality and make what accommodation they could with the new order, becoming mercenaries or champions serving Ork war bosses who recognized the value of having power-armored warriors in their service. These fallen angels, as they might call themselves, would be reviled by the few remaining loyalists, but would survive when pure loyalty meant only death. The Adeptus Mechanicus would face their own existential crisis. Their entire religious framework centers on the machine god and the sacred nature of technology. But Ork technology, especially awakened Ork technology, functions through principles that violate everything the Mechanicus believes about how machines should work. Some tech priests would go mad trying to reconcile what they observed with what they believed. Others would commit tech heresy by attempting to study and replicate Ork techniques, reasoning that if the machine god allowed such technology to exist, it must be within his design somehow. A radical faction within the Mechanicus might even propose that the Gestalt field represents a previously unknown aspect of the machine god's will, that collective psychic engineering is a valid path to technological advancement that orthodox Mechanicus doctrine has overlooked. These heretics would be hunted by their more traditional brethren, but in an Ork-dominated galaxy, who would have the resources to conduct such purges? The Mechanicus might fracture into competing sects, some maintaining traditional practices in hidden enclaves, others embracing hybrid Ork imperial techniques in desperate attempts to maintain relevance. The Eldar, assuming any survived outside the webway, would see the Ork ascension as the final confirmation of their civilization's decline. They fought the Krork during the War in Heaven when the Eldar were at their peak, when their gods walked among them and their psychic powers reshaped reality itself. Even then, the Krork were formidable opponents. Now, with the Eldar reduced to scattered remnants clinging to existence, facing the Krork's return would be impossible. The craft worlds would become ghost ships, empty hulks drifting through space, their populations fled to the webway, or dead in final stands against green tides they couldn't hope to stop. Comora, the dark Eldar city in the webway, might actually benefit in strange ways. The Dark Eldar survive through raiding and piracy, taking what they need from other species. An Ork-dominated galaxy would provide endless opportunities for raids, as Orks left plenty of non-Ork populations intact to serve as labor forces. While the Dark Eldar could strike quickly through webway portals, take what they wanted, and retreat before Ork retaliation arrived. The Orks might even develop a grudging respect for enemies who fight smart and disappear rather than dying stupidly. In the twisted logic of Ork culture, the Dark Eldar might become valued opponents, worthy of being fought again and again. The Tau would probably adapt better than most other factions, simply because their civilization is young enough to not be trapped by 10,000 years of rigid doctrine. The Tau believe in the greater good, which at its core is a pragmatic philosophy about working together to achieve optimal outcomes. If serving Ork war bosses as technical specialists and administrators achieved better outcomes than pointless resistance, untold leaders would make that choice without the kind of ideological crisis that would paralyze imperial authorities. The Tau might even find ways to subtly influence their Ork overlords, using the same techniques they've historically used to bring other species into their empire. An Ork war boss surrounded by Tau advisors might make decisions that served Tau interests without realizing he was being manipulated. The Orks wouldn't particularly care as long as they got good fights and their decisions seemed sound. A strange symbiosis could develop where Tau provided administrative competence and Orks provided military dominance, creating a combined civilization more effective than either species could achieve independently. The Necrons, ancient and patient, would retreat to their tomb worlds and wait. Or they've waited 60 million years already. They could wait another 60 million if necessary. the Necrons would seal their tombs, set their defenses to maximum, and enter hibernation until such time as the Krork either destroyed themselves through internal warfare or evolved into something the Necrons could negotiate with. The Silent King, if he still lived, might even see Krork resurgence as an acceptable outcome. Better the Krork, who at least fought honestly, than chaos which corrupted everything it touched, or the Tyranids which consumed all life indiscriminately. Some Necron dynasties might choose to fight, particularly those whose pharaohs remembered the war in heaven personally and held ancient grudges against the Krork. These dynasties would deploy their full arsenal, world-destroying weapons, time manipulation devices, a stellar engineering that could nova a sun or collapse it into a black hole. Individual battles would be spectacular, with Necron technology matching awakened Ork capabilities in straight combat. But the numbers wouldn't favor the Necrons. Even if each Necron warrior could kill 1,000 Orks before being destroyed, there would be more Orks to take their place. The Necrons learned this lesson during the war in heaven and wouldn't be eager to repeat it. Chaos would be the great unknown in an Ork-dominated galaxy. The Chaos gods feed on emotions and draw power from the suffering and excess of mortal beings. An Ork-dominated galaxy would produce different emotional resonances than the current Millennium. Orks don't despair, so Nurgle would weaken. Orks don't scheme in complex ways, so Tzeentch would find fewer opportunities for manipulation. Orks don't pursue pleasure as a goal in itself, so Slaanesh would struggle to corrupt them. Only Khorne would find the Ork ascension beneficial, as Orks produce violence and bloodshed on scales that would make the blood god stronger than ever. But even Khorne would face challenges. The Orks don't fight for Khorne or dedicate their victories to chaos. They fight for Gork and Mork, and those Ork gods would be growing stronger in the warp, potentially challenging the Chaos gods directly. A war between Ork gods and Chaos gods in the Imperium would be a conflict beyond mortal comprehension, reality itself tearing at the seams as incompatible forces struggled for dominance. The material galaxy might be torn apart by warp storms spawned from their battles, or paradoxically, might become more stable as the fighting gods cancelled out each other's worst excesses. Chaos Space Marines, trapped between dying Imperial remnants and ascendant Orks, would have to choose between servitude to Ork war bosses or extinction. Some, particularly those dedicated to Khorne, might embrace service to the Orks as a continuation of their endless pursuit of combat and bloodshed. Imagine a Chaos war boss leading a war band that included both awakened Orks and Chaos Marines, the combined force more terrifying than either component separately. These hybrid forces would be nightmares in both material and immaterial realms, spreading corruption and destruction in equal measure. The Emperor, locked in his golden throne on Terra, would face the ultimate failure. 10,000 years of sacrifice, billions of psychers consumed to keep his broken body functioning, all to preserve the Imperium of man against the dangers of the galaxy. And in the end, it wouldn't be Chaos or Tyranids or Necrons that destroyed his vision. It would be the same Xenos he defeated at Ullanor during the Great Crusade return to their full glory, achieving what Horus and all the traitor legions couldn't accomplish, the total defeat of humanity's empire. Perhaps in his final moments, as Ork forces fought their way through the Imperial Palace, as the Custodian Guard fell one by one against overwhelming numbers of Prime Orks, as the last defenses failed and green-skinned warriors breached the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the Emperor would recognize the bitter irony. And he had created Space Marines based partially on genetic templates that might have drawn inspiration from the same Old One biotechnology that created the Krork. He had built an empire through military conquest, never negotiating, never compromising, teaching humanity that only through endless war could survival be achieved. And now, as Orks destroyed everything he built, he would understand that he had trained humanity to think like Orks, to value strength and victory above all else. The Orks hadn't won by being different. They had won by being better at the very thing the Emperor had made central to human culture, total war. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the teacher's empire would fall because of it. Would the emperor die when his throne failed? Or would he finally achieve the transcendence into full godhood that had been prevented by his imprisonment? Would a newborn god of humanity emerge in the warp, finally able to act without the constraints of his physical form? And if such a god emerged, would it fight the ascendant Ork gods? Or would it recognize the futility of that struggle and seek some other solution? These questions might never be answered, because in an Ork-dominated galaxy, human civilization would be fragmented into scattered remnants with no unified culture or identity. The emperor would be forgotten within generations, his name becoming just another legend among many, his Imperium remembered as the brief period when humans ruled themselves before the Orks brought order through superior strength. As the long-term future of an Ork-dominated galaxy is actually difficult to predict, because it depends on whether awakened Orks maintain their Krork-level sophistication or eventually degrade again. The Krork fell before because they lacked external pressure to maintain their elevated state. But if awakened Orks established themselves as the dominant power, would they create that pressure themselves by constantly fighting each other? Could they maintain a balance where internal warfare kept them sharp without destroying their civilization? It's possible that awakened Orks would actually achieve a more stable galactic civilization than any other faction could create. Ork hierarchy is simple and mostly non-political. The biggest leads, and everyone else follows. There's no complex bureaucracy to become corrupt, no religious schisms to spawn civil wars, no ideological conflicts between competing philosophical frameworks. Disputes are settled through violence, which, while brutal, is at least straightforward and conclusive. An Ork-ruled galaxy would be violent but predictable, deadly but honest. Trade between Ork-held systems would flourish in unexpected ways. Orks need raw materials for their technology and food for their populations. They could conquer those resources through constant warfare, but awakened Orks understand logistics and might recognize that trade is more efficient than endless raiding. Ork merchant fleets would carry goods between systems, protected by overwhelming force against pirates and raiders. The Orks would care less about profit margins than ensuring resources flowed where needed to support ongoing wars elsewhere. And the human populations under Ork rule might actually develop technologies and societies that the Imperium had suppressed. The Imperium forbade technological innovation not blessed by the Mechanicus, executed anyone who displayed psychic powers they couldn't control, and destroyed entire worlds for ideological deviations. Orks wouldn't care about any of that. As long as humans paid tribute and didn't rebel, they could do whatever they wanted with their technology and culture. Freed from imperial restrictions, human innovation might flourish in ways that benefited both species. Within a few centuries, you might see human engineers working alongside Ork mech boys, combining human precision with Ork instinctive understanding of Gestalt field mechanics. You might see human psychers studying under Ork weird boys, learning to channel Warg energy in ways that neither species could achieve separately. You might even see cultural exchange, with humans adopting some Ork values and Orks adopting some human organizational methods, creating a hybrid civilization that was neither fully Ork nor fully human, but something new. The greatest tragedy of such a future would be the loss of human potential. Humanity in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is presented as a species with vast unrealized potential, capable of achieving heights of technology and culture that exceed even the Eldar at their peak if given the freedom and time to develop. But under Ork domination, that potential would never be realized because humans would always be subordinate, always limited by the need to serve Ork interests, always prevented from achieving their own destiny. Yet perhaps even that tragedy contains seeds of hope. History shows that subordinate cultures often outlast their conquerors through simple persistence. The Orks would dominate militarily, but they'd rely on humans for technical and administrative functions they couldn't be bothered with. Over centuries or millennia, the humans who served Ork war bosses might become indispensable, and indispensability creates leverage. A clever human advisor to an Ork war boss could influence decisions in ways that served human interests without the war boss realizing he was being manipulated. 10,000 years of Ork domination might end not with a grand rebellion or military victory, but with a gradual realization that the Orks needed humans more than humans needed Orks. The war bosses would still be bigger and stronger. He'd still win any physical confrontation, but they'd be dependent on human systems and human knowledge to maintain their civilization. And dependency, even when backed by overwhelming force, creates vulnerabilities that patient adversaries can exploit. But that's speculation piled on speculation, futures within futures, outcomes that depend on countless variables and choices that haven't been made yet. The reality is simpler and more immediate. If the Orks fully remember their power, if the Gestalt field triggers mass genetic activation across billions of greenskins simultaneously, the resulting transformation would reshape the galaxy in ways that no current faction could prevent or reverse. The Imperium would fall. The Space Marines would be overwhelmed. The Mechanicus would collapse. The Elder would retreat or die. I said the Tau would submit or be destroyed. The Necrons would hide. The Tyranids would be fought to a standstill. Chaos would find its influence diminished. And the Orks, the species that every other faction underestimates as crude barbarians, would inherit the galaxy not through cunning or manipulation, but through the simple application of overwhelming force wielded with unexpected sophistication. This future hasn't happened yet. The Orks remain in their degraded state, fighting among themselves as often as against external enemies, building crude technology that barely functions, following war bosses who plan only as far as the next battle. The genetic potential exists, the Gestalt field continues to strengthen, and figures like Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka show what individual Orks can become when circumstances trigger their latent capabilities. But the full awakening, the moment when millions or billions of Orks simultaneously access their Krork heritage, hasn't occurred. Yet, the conditions for that awakening grow more favorable every year. Ork populations increase. Wars rage across more worlds. The Gestalt field strengthens with each gathering of green tides. Gazkul continues to grow larger and more powerful with each resurrection. The signs are all there for anyone with eyes to see and the knowledge to interpret them correctly. The Imperium, trapped in its bureaucratic inertia and doctrinal blindness, refuses to recognize the pattern. They see Orks as a manageable threat, and an endless nuisance to be purged repeatedly, but never truly dangerous to the Imperium's survival. They're wrong. The Orks are the most dangerous threat in the galaxy, not because of what they are, but because of what they could become. And every day that passes, every battle fought, every world conquered, every spore planted, brings them closer to that transformation. The galaxy stands on the edge of an abyss, and the green tide rising from its depths could swallow everything that currently exists. The point of no return. Can it be stopped? Understanding the mechanics of Ork awakening leads inevitably to a critical question. Can the process be stopped once it begins? Is there a point of no return past which intervention becomes futile? And if such intervention is possible, what would it require and who could execute it? The answer to the first question is deeply uncomfortable for anyone concerned with galactic stability. Yes, there's almost certainly a point of no return, and we may have already passed it. The Gestalt field operates below conscious awareness, spreading knowledge and genetic activation through psychic networks that can't be severed or blocked through conventional means. Once the awakening process begins in earnest, once enough Orks have accessed enough Krork genetic programming, the feedback loops become self-sustaining and potentially irreversible. Think of it like a nuclear chain reaction. When enough fissile material reaches critical mass, neutrons released from splitting atoms cause more atoms to split, which release more neutrons, which split more atoms. The process feeds on itself, accelerating exponentially until either all available material is consumed or something physically separates the components to break the chain. The Gestalt field functions similarly. When enough Orks access Krork genetics, they strengthen the field. The stronger field triggers more genetic activation in more orcs. Those newly awakened orcs strengthen the field further. The cycle continues, accelerating, spreading through the entire orc population like a wildfire consuming dry tinder. Breaking such a chain reaction requires either eliminating the fuel or disrupting the mechanism. For orcs, eliminating the fuel means killing orcs faster than they can reproduce, an impossible task given their spore-based biology and exponential growth rates. Even if you could sterilize entire worlds, burn every spore, kill every orc, you'd need to do so simultaneously across thousands of worlds, because orcs on one world can't trigger awakening in orcs on distant worlds through the Gestalt field. Miss even one significant orc population and the awakening continues there, potentially spreading again once those orcs begin expanding into cleared territory. Disrupting the mechanism means breaking the Gestalt field itself, severing the psychic connections that allow knowledge and genetic activation to propagate between orcs. This is theoretically possible, but practically impossible to achieve at the scale required. During the War of the Beast, the Imperium created a reverse Gestalt field, using captured orc psychers and Sisters of Silence to temporarily weaken orc forces. This technique worked on a limited scale, affecting orcs in a specific region for a limited time. And scaling it up to affect all orcs everywhere simultaneously would require resources and coordination that no faction in the galaxy currently possesses. The Sisters of Silence are blanks, individuals whose souls create voids in the warp, rather than the normal psychic presence. Their very existence nullifies psychic phenomena in their vicinity. In theory, deploying enough Sisters of Silence across all orc-held worlds could disrupt the Gestalt field locally. In practice, there aren't nearly enough Sisters of Silence to cover even a fraction of the territory involved. The organization was nearly destroyed during the Horus Heresy and has never fully recovered. Even at their peak numbers, they couldn't blanket entire star systems, much less the thousands of systems where orcs reside. What about more extreme measures? The Imperium possesses weapons capable of destroying entire planets. Exterminatus protocols can reduce a world to a lifeless cinder through cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombing, or sustained orbital bombardment. Could the Imperium prevent orc awakening by simply destroying every world with significant orc populations? No, for multiple reasons. First, the number of orc-infested worlds is staggering, potentially numbering in the tens of thousands or more. Executing Exterminatus on that scale would require the Imperium to destroy a significant portion of its own industrial capacity, as many of those worlds are officially Imperial, even if orc infestations lurk in their underhives or remote regions. The economic and political cost would be catastrophic, even before considering the military resources required. Second, Exterminatus doesn't guarantee complete spore elimination. Orc spores are remarkably resilient, capable of surviving in vacuum, extreme temperatures, and radiation levels that would sterilize normal biological matter. Unless the planet is literally disintegrated, some spores will survive in debris or be ejected into space on fragments of the destroyed world. Those spores could drift for years or centuries before landing on another world and beginning the cycle again. Third, and most critically, the decision to execute Exterminatus on thousands of worlds would require political will and coordination that the Imperium simply doesn't possess. The High Lords of Terror can barely agree on how to respond to obvious immediate threats, as getting them to authorize the destruction of thousands of Imperial worlds based on the theoretical possibility that orcs might become more dangerous would be impossible. By the time the threat became obvious enough to overcome political inertia, it would be far too late to implement such a solution. Could the Eldar stop it? They have the most knowledge about the Krork and the greatest historical understanding of what awakened orcs represent. Some Craftworld farseers must be having visions of the coming catastrophe, seeing futures where green tides consume everything. But what could the Eldar actually do with that knowledge? The Eldar are masters of precision strikes and subtle manipulation. They could identify individual orcs, showing signs of genetic awakening, and assassinate them before they could influence the broader population. They could manipulate events to prevent large orc gatherings that might trigger stronger Gestalt field effects. They could even seed false information into orc populations, trying to misdirect them away from behaviors that promote awakening. All of these techniques have worked in the past, at small scales. Eldar Rangers and Pathfinders regularly eliminate orc leaders who show unexpected cunning or sophistication. Eldar Seers manipulate probability threads to prevent the worst outcomes from manifesting, but the scale of the current threat dwarfs anything these methods could address. How do you assassinate thousands of awakening orcs simultaneously across hundreds of worlds? How do you manipulate enough events to prevent billions of orcs from gathering and fighting, when gathering and fighting is literally their entire purpose for existing? The Eldar could potentially make things worse by trying to stop it. Every orc they kill releases spores. Every assassination creates a power vacuum that allows a potentially more dangerous leader to rise. Every manipulation that prevents one threat might create 3 others. The Eldar work with subtlety and precision, but the orc awakening is neither subtle nor precise. It's a biological and psychic juggernaut that can't be deflected through clever manipulation because it's not guided by any intelligence they could deceive or any plan they could disrupt. What about the Necrons? Their technology includes weapons that manipulate time, rewrite physical laws, and harvest stars. Surely beings who fought the Krork at their peak during the War in Heaven would have developed countermeasures. The Necrons did develop such countermeasures, and they're called running away and hiding for 60 million years. The Necrons chose biotransference and became immortal machines, partly because they couldn't defeat the Old Ones and their creations through conventional means. They won the War in Heaven by shattering the Citan and turning the fragments into weapons, then entered their great sleep rather than trying to hold territory against the surviving younger races. The current Necrons, slowly awakening from their tomb worlds, remember the Krork as enemies they barely survived fighting when the Necrons were at full strength. A fully awakened Necron empire, or with all tomb worlds active and all their ancient technology functioning, might be able to fight awakened orcs to a standstill. But that empire doesn't exist. The Necrons are fragmentary, their dynasties operating independently when they operate at all, their technology degraded by millions of years of inactivity. Most tomb worlds remain dormant. Those that have awakened find themselves immediately beset by other threats and can't afford to focus exclusively on preventing orc evolution. Individual Necron dynasties might attempt to eliminate orc populations in their immediate vicinity, using their most devastating weapons to ensure complete destruction. But this would be defensive action, protecting specific tomb worlds rather than addressing the galaxy-wide threat. If the Necrons are too divided and too depleted to mount the kind of coordinated response that might actually prevent orc awakening, their best strategy, and the one most Pharons would likely choose, is the same one they used before: retreat to safety and wait for the storm to pass. Could the Tyranids inadvertently solve the problem? Their hunger knows no bounds, their reproductive rate rivals the orcs, and they consume all biological matter they encounter. If a Tyranid hive fleet arrived in force at an orc-held region, it would certainly kill countless orcs. But as discussed earlier, Tyranids killing orcs just spreads more spores, creating more orcs for future harvests. Unless the Tyranids achieved perfect biological sterilization, they'd be fighting an enemy that regrows faster than they can consume it. More likely, the Tyranids would recognize orc-held space as a long-term resource rather than a target for immediate consumption. Attack an orc world, harvest biomass, withdraw before the orcs can mount effective resistance, let the spores grow into new orcs, return in a few years, and harvest again. From the Tyranid perspective, this would be farming rather than hunting, maintaining a renewable resource that produces the biomass they need without depleting it. From everyone else's perspective, it would be a nightmare scenario where two of the galaxy's most dangerous species achieve a stable relationship that ensures both survive and thrive. The uncomfortable truth is that no single faction can stop orc awakening once it reaches critical momentum. The Imperium lacks the unity and resources. The Eldar lack the numbers and strength. The Necrons lack the willingness to risk themselves. The Tau lack the reach and power. The Tyranids are more likely to stabilize the situation than solve it. Chaos might make things worse rather than better. What about an alliance? Could multiple factions work together to address the common threat before it becomes unstoppable? History suggests this is possible in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. The Imperium and Eldar have cooperated against common enemies on rare occasions, always temporarily and always fraught with mistrust. Expanding such cooperation to include Tau, Necrons, or even select Chaos forces would require diplomatic efforts and political will that simply don't exist. Even if an alliance could be formed, what would it do? Launch simultaneous crusades against every major Orc stronghold? And that might slow the awakening, but wouldn't stop it, and the cost in lives and resources would cripple all participants. Create a permanent blockade around Orc-held space, preventing expansion. Orcs can build ships and would eventually break through any blockade. Develop a biological weapon that targets Orcs specifically. The Imperium tried this during the Great Crusade and failed, because Orc biology is too resilient and adaptable. The most realistic assessment is that Orc awakening probably can't be stopped through direct action once it begins in earnest. The biological and psychic mechanisms driving it are too robust, too distributed, too self-reinforcing to be disrupted on the scale required. The only practical solution would be preventing it from starting in the first place, which requires recognizing the warning signs early and taking preventive action before critical mass is reached. And there, finally, is the crux of the tragedy. The warning signs are already present. Gazkul grows larger and more sophisticated. Green tides sweep across more worlds than at any point in recent history. The Gestalt field strengthens year by year. Orc technology shows incremental improvements. War bosses demonstrate increasing strategic acumen. Every sign points toward accelerating evolution toward Krork status. But no faction is taking preventive action, because no faction truly understands what these signs mean. The Imperium sees Orcs as eternal nuisances to be managed, rather than existential threats to be eliminated. The Eldar are too few and too divided to mount effective prevention. The Necrons don't care about problems that won't affect their tomb worlds immediately. Everyone else either doesn't understand the threat, or lacks the resources to address it. So the awakening continues, unchecked, accelerating toward a tipping point that may have already been passed. The Orcs remember, slowly but surely, what they were designed to be. And when the remembering is complete, when the last genetic sequences activate and the Gestalt field reaches full strength, the galaxy will face a threat that can't be defeated, only endured or fled from. The point of no return may be a specific moment in time, a day when the 1000th Prime Orc awakens, or when the Gestalt field reaches some threshold of strength that triggers cascade activation across the entire species. Or it may be a gradual boundary, as a period spanning years or decades, when intervention becomes progressively less feasible, until one day someone realizes it's been too late for a long time and no one noticed. Either way, the galaxy is running out of time. The green tide rises. The Orcs remember. And soon, very soon, everyone will understand exactly what the old ones created when they built the perfect warriors 60 million years ago. That understanding will come too late to matter, but it will be complete and absolute as the last strongholds fall and the last resistance crumbles beneath the weight of countless green-skinned warriors who finally remember that they were made to be unstoppable. Closing thoughts. The inevitability of green. So we return to the question we started with. What if the Orcs remember how powerful they truly are? As we've explored the mechanisms through which such remembering might occur, examined the historical precedents that demonstrate it's already happened before, analyzed the strategic implications of a fully awakened Orc species, and assessed whether anything could stop the process once it begins. The answers we found are uncomfortable, even terrifying. but they point toward a conclusion that's difficult to escape. The Ork awakening isn't a matter of if, but when. The biological and psychic structures that made the Krork successful remain encoded in Ork DNA, waiting for the right triggers to activate them. Those triggers aren't exotic or unlikely. They're simply sustained warfare against powerful enemies, combined with large populations and unified purpose, all conditions that exist in abundance in the 41st millennium. Every major conflict draws Orks like moths to flame, creating exactly the pressure that drives their evolution. Every green tide strengthens the gestalt field that connects them all. Every year sees more Orks on more worlds, approaching the critical mass that transforms individual awakening into species-wide transformation. Gazgakul Mag Uruk Thraka is the canary in the coal mine, the living proof that Orks can access their Krork heritage through means as simple as head trauma and cybernetic enhancement. He demonstrates that the genetic potential is there, ready and waiting, requiring only the right catalyst to express itself. And he's not unique. Other war bosses across the galaxy show similar signs of enhanced capability, if not quite to the same degree. The process has already begun. The question isn't whether it will continue, but how fast it will accelerate, and whether anyone will recognize what's happening before it's too late. The tragedy of the situation is that the very systems meant to protect the galaxy from threats actually make the Ork threat worse. The Imperium's doctrine of endless warfare creates perfect conditions for Ork evolution. Every crusade is an opportunity for Orks to fight powerful enemies and grow stronger. Every planetary defense becomes a siege where Orks gather in huge numbers, strengthening their gestalt field. The Imperium's response to Ork incursions, throwing more troops and resources into grinding wars of attrition, is exactly what Orks need to trigger their genetic programming. If the Imperium truly understood the threat, they'd avoid fighting Orks entirely. I'll quarantine Ork-held systems and wait for them to fall into infighting and civil war, as Orks always do when left alone. But that strategy would require abandoning Imperial worlds to Ork occupation, accepting territorial losses rather than fighting to reclaim every system. The Imperium's political structure and ideological framework make such choices impossible. They must fight, must resist, must throw everything they have at any threat to Imperial sovereignty. And in doing so, they ensure that the Orks continue to face the exact challenges that make them stronger. The Eldar could explain this to Imperial authorities, could warn them about what their tactics are creating, but would anyone listen? The Imperium views the Eldar as deceitful Xenos whose counsel can't be trusted. How even if an Eldar Farseer managed to gain an audience with the High Lords of Terror and explained in detail how Imperial strategy was accelerating Ork evolution, the message would be dismissed as Xenos manipulation, or misunderstood through the lens of Imperial prejudice. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years being right about everything through the simple expedient of killing anyone who disagreed with them. They're psychologically incapable of accepting that they might be fundamentally wrong about something as basic as how to fight Orks. So the cycle continues. The Imperium fights, the Orks grow stronger, the gestalt field intensifies, more war bosses awaken to their potential. The technology improves incrementally year after year, and everyone except a few Eldar Farseers fails to recognize the pattern, but fails to see that they're witnessing the early stages of something that will fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. There's a grim poetry to it all, really. The Imperium was built by the Emperor through military conquest, establishing dominance through superior force and strategic brilliance. The Emperor's vision was that humanity could rule the galaxy by being the strongest, the most determined, the most willing to do whatever it took to win. He created the Space Marines, genetically engineered super soldiers, to be his weapons in that conquest. He built an empire on the principle that might makes right, and the strong have the authority to rule the weak. And now that empire faces defeat at the hands of a species that took those same principles and refined them to perfection over 60 million years. The Orks don't have complex politics or religious disputes or ideological conflicts. They don't waste energy on anything except fighting and building things that help them fight better. They are what the Emperor tried to make humanity. perfect warriors completely focused on conquest and dominance. The irony is that humanity can't beat them at their own game because the Orks were designed for that game by beings far more advanced than the Emperor ever was. If there's any hope in this scenario, it's that awakened Orks might not be as destructive as awakened Krork would have been during the War in Heaven. The Krork were created to fight the Necrons and Satan, enemies of godlike power who threatened the existence of all life. The pressure of that conflict shaped the Krork into merciless killing machines that couldn't afford pity or mercy or any sentiment that might compromise their effectiveness. Modern Orks, even as they access Krork genetics, are products of a different environment. They've spent millions of years fighting less overwhelming threats, developing a culture that values good fights rather than total annihilation. An awakened Ork species might be less genocidal than their ancestors. They might recognize the value of preserving defeated enemies as future opponents, creating a kind of enforced peace where violence is channeled into controlled warfare rather than mindless slaughter. This wouldn't be peace as other species understand it, but it might be survivable in ways that facing the original Krork wasn't. Or humans under Ork rule would be subjects rather than corpses, and while their freedom would be limited and their lives violent, they'd at least have lives to live. But perhaps even that hope is too optimistic. Perhaps the Krork programming, once fully activated, overrides millions of years of cultural development and transforms Orks into the merciless warriors the Old Ones designed. Perhaps the Gestalt field, at full strength, creates a collective consciousness so focused on warfare that individual Ork psychology becomes irrelevant. We don't know because it hasn't happened yet, and the only time it came close, during the War of the Beast, humanity was too busy desperately fighting for survival to study Ork culture and psychology in detail. What we do know is that the galaxy is changing, has been changing for centuries, accelerating toward a transformation that few recognize and fewer understand. The signs are everywhere for those with the knowledge to interpret them. The Orks grow stronger. Their technology improves. Their strategies become more sophisticated. Their leaders display intelligence and planning that should be impossible for what everyone dismisses as crude barbarians. All the indicators point in one direction, toward awakening, toward the return of the Krork, toward a future where the green tide doesn't just raid and ravage, but conquers and holds, building an empire that might actually last. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. That's the famous tagline, the fundamental premise of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. But perhaps that tagline needs updating for the age of Ork ascension. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are only Orks. Everything else is just targets waiting their turn, enemies whose resistance makes the fighting more enjoyable, but whose defeat is ultimately inevitable. The Orks will remember who they are, what they were designed to be, the full scope of the power locked away in their genetic code. And when that remembering is complete, when the last Ork boy accesses the last sequence and the Gestalt field reaches its full potential, the galaxy will discover what the Old Ones knew 60 million years ago, that the perfect warrior race, once unleashed, can't be stopped through force because they were designed specifically to overcome any force arrayed against them. That's the answer to our question. That's what happens when the Orks remember how powerful they truly are. The galaxy burns green. It's transformed by endless war into exactly what the Orks were made for. An eternal battlefield where the strong dominate the weak and the biggest war boss rules over all. It's not the future anyone wanted, except perhaps Gork and Mork, who watch from the warp and smile with tusked mouths, pleased to see their children finally fulfilling their destiny. The green tide rises, the Orks remember, and the galaxy will never be the same. If you enjoyed this exploration into one of Warhammer 40,000's most terrifying what-if scenarios, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, countless more questions to explore about what might happen if circumstances aligned differently. The Orc awakening is just one possibility among many, but it's one that deserves attention precisely because it's so plausible, so consistent with everything we know about Orc biology and history, and so absolutely catastrophic in its implications. The Warhammer universe is built on the premise that humanity faces extinction from countless threats, any one of which could end civilization, if not constantly opposed. But of all those threats, the Orcs might be the most dangerous precisely because everyone underestimates them. They're the comic relief, the crude barbarians who paint their vehicles red because they think it makes them go faster, who speak in broken English and solve every problem by hitting it with a hammer. It's easy to dismiss them as less dangerous than the existential horror of the Tyranids or the corrupting influence of chaos or the cold perfection of the Necrons. But the Orcs are the remnants of the Krork, and the Krork fought gods and survived. That heritage doesn't disappear just because it's been dormant for millions of years. The genetic memory remains, waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. And as we've seen throughout this analysis, those conditions exist right now, growing more favorable every year. The Orcs are waking up, slowly, inconsistently, without coordination or plan. They're beginning to access what they used to be. And if that process continues, if it reaches the tipping point where awakening becomes self-sustaining and spreads through the entire species, then everything changes. That's the future that should keep everyone in the Warhammer universe awake at night. Not the obvious threats like Tyranid hive fleets or chaos invasions, but the gradual, edge almost invisible transformation of the galaxy's most numerous species, from crude barbarians into sophisticated warriors who remember that they were designed to be invincible. When that transformation is complete, there won't be any last stand of desperate heroes holding the line against impossible odds. There will just be the slow recognition that the galaxy belongs to the Orcs now, has probably belonged to them for a while, and will continue to belong to them forever. The green tide rises, the Orcs remember, and the only question that remains is whether anyone will recognize what's happening before it's too late to matter. Based on the Imperium's track record of ignoring warnings until disaster becomes unavoidable, the answer is almost certainly no. Thanks for watching, stay vigilant, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but soon, very soon, there might only be Orcs.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.